This is a recognition. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and add extraneous material on H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up H.R. 986 and ask for its immediate consideration.
I'll respond to that. That's just ridiculous. We're just appointing someone to the committee of the whole.
Are we ready?
Yeah. That's
Pursuant to House Resolution 357 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of House Resolution 986. The Chair, or 986, the Chair appoints the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole on the State of the Union for the consideration of House Resolution 986, H.R. 966, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to provide that certain guidance related to waivers for state innovation under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act shall have no force or effect.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman will suspend. The committee will be in order. Please proceed.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to speak in favor of H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act, introduced by Representative Custer from our committee. This legislation should not be necessary, but unfortunately, the Trump administration continues to take actions that undermine the health care of millions of Americans, including the more than 133 million people with pre-existing conditions. Today, we're here because the Trump administration's proposed guidance last October that would allow states to expand and prop up short-term junk insurance plans, even providing taxpayer subsidies for those plans. In order to take this action, the administration blatantly ignored the plain text of the Affordable Care Act and gutted standards that states must meet in order to test insurance reforms. And I believe the administration's action is illegal. But sadly, this administration has never let the law get in the way of its goals. These efforts will without a doubt seriously undermine the health coverage of Americans with pre-existing conditions. A coalition of 24 national groups representing millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions, including the American Cancer Society, the Cancer Action Network, the American Heart Association, and the American Diabetes Association, wrote a letter in strong support of H.R. 986 stating, and I'm quoting now, The 1332 guidance substantially erodes the guardrails governing coverage that people with pre-existing conditions such as cystic fibrosis, lung disease, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, rare disorders, pregnant women, and many others rely on in the individual marketplace. End of quote. The patient organizations go on to say that these changes fundamentally alter the nature of Section 1332 waiver program and jeopardize adequate affordable coverage for people with pre-existing conditions in the individual marketplace. Halting the implementation of this guidance will protect people with pre-existing conditions. Now, Mr. Chairman, by encouraging states to promote and expand short-term insurance plans, the administration is giving insurers the green light to directly discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. It's giving the green light for these plans to charge people with pre-existing conditions more money, and it's giving these plans the green light to refuse to cover any treatment that is related to someone's pre-existing condition. The expansion of these junk plans will also undermine the insurance market, leading to higher premiums for people with pre-existing conditions who need comprehensive coverage. And this is not the way you protect people with pre-existing conditions. The Trump administration's guidance also undermines the ACA's promise of coverage of essential health benefits. The American people should not have to worry about whether their insurance plan covers prescription drugs, paternity and newborn care, mental health, and substance use disorder services. And this guidance is also bad news for older Americans who could be charged a lot more for their insurance than what is allowed by the ACA. In a nutshell, Mr. Chairman, this guidance is bad news for any American who wants access to quality and affordable health coverage that is there for them when they need it. Junk plans are just that. They're junk. People shouldn't have to read the fine print to see what is and is not covered, and that's the hallmark of the Affordable Care Act. So that's why we must rescind the guidance, and I want to commend my colleague, Ms. Custer, for her great work on this important bill. I do want to emphasize that H.R. 986 would not do anything to interfere with existing 1332 reinsurance waivers, which have bipartisan support and began under the Obama administration. My Republican colleagues continue to intentionally conflate these reinsurance waivers with the Trump administration's new 1332 waiver guidance from October of last year. H.R. 986 does not affect these reinsurance waivers. I'm disappointed that my Republican colleagues continue to make these arguments, but the bad faith is not surprising given their terrible record on protecting people with pre-existing conditions. So, Mr. Chairman, this bill is necessary because of the ongoing assault by the Trump administration on our healthcare system. I urge my colleagues to join me in standing up for the people with pre-existing conditions and standing up for people who want access to affordable and quality healthcare. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I rise today to call out the mischaracterization of H.R. 986. The misleading title of this bill confirms the Democratic majority's position to score political points instead of governing. They claim their agenda is for the people. Well, this bill is for the politics. So let me be clear. This bill has nothing to do with protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. This bill has everything to do with eliminating healthcare options that would be affordable for Americans who can't afford health insurance today and choices for states. Section 1332 waivers were first enacted under Obamacare to provide states the opportunity to innovate and to provide their residents with affordable health insurance options. The Trump administration has simply updated the guidance for these 1332 Obamacare waivers to make it easier for states' plan to be approved. This guidance does not, and I repeat, does not permit the Secretary to waive pre-existing condition protections, period. But don't take my word for it alone. CMS Administrator Seema Verma confirmed yesterday in writing, quote, "To be clear, the 2018 guidance does nothing to erode PPACA's pre-existing condition provisions, which cannot be waived under Section 1332, wrote Administrator Verma. And then she went on to explain, and I quote, Section 1332 does not permit states to waive Public Health Service Act requirements, such as guaranteed availability and renewability of health insurance, the prohibition on using health status to vary premiums, and the prohibition on pre-existing condition exclusions Furthermore, a Section 1332 waiver cannot be approved that might otherwise undermine these requirements. This administration stands committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions, period, quote. Seema Verma, she's the administrator. And it's not just her. I want to quote from the Trump administration statement of policy. If H.R. 986 were presented to the president, his advisors would recommend that he veto it, wrote the Trump administration in their statement of administration policy. They go on to say, and I quote, the president has repeatedly made clear that this administration will protect people with pre-existing conditions. 2018 guidance in no way alters the guardrails in place for those with pre-existing conditions, and it would not allow the administration to waive the requirements in place around pre-existing conditions. The title of this legislation gives the misleading impression that it will enhance health care protections for Americans with pre-existing conditions, close quote. Put simply, Mr. Chair, this cynically titled messaging bill is all about scoring political points and not legislating, which is actually what we should be doing. You see, if Democratic members actually cared about protecting individuals living with pre-existing conditions, they'd govern and lock in these important safeguards. But since Democratic leaders chose to put politics first, I offered an amendment to protect patients with pre-existing conditions, to actually lock that into law. Mr. Chairman, this amendment wasn't presented to the House for a vote. In fact, it was never allowed out of the Rules Committee. That's a shame, because we could be voting on it today. I've tried to bring that vote to the floor on numerous occasions, been denied by the Democratic majority. My bill is simple. It provides guaranteed issue and renewability, a ban on health status underwriting, a ban on benefits exclusions, and real pre-existing condition protections. Democratic members claim they support. Guess what? It's titled the Pre-Existing Conditions Protection Act. How ironic. Except my bill actually does what the title says. So let's vote on that bill, Mr. Chair. Here's what it comes down to. The status quo is not working for many Americans. Healthcare costs are out of control. Patients and families are struggling to pay ever-increasing premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket costs. And there is work that we're doing. I just came from a meeting with the President of the United States in the Roosevelt Room talking about surprise billing. And we're actually going to work together, Mr. Pallone and I, and others, to draft legislation to prevent that, to protect consumers. We could do more here today than what this bill alleges to do. Republicans want to work toward healthcare solutions that will decrease costs, increase access, protect individuals with pre-existing conditions, and make the healthcare system work better for families, for patients, and actually be affordable. We want to let our states innovate, and these Section 1332 waivers, originally, again, put forward under President Obama, known as state innovation waivers, they're actually working, Mr. Chair. Premiums have gone down in 7 states by an average of 20%, down 20%. In my home state of Oregon, we've been a real innovator for decades in the space of healthcare coverage and access and trying to get price down. Our premiums under this 1332 waiver that Oregon have gone down 6% in 2018, down 6%, thanks to a state innovation waiver. These waivers could work. States want to innovate. They care about their people and want to bring down costs. But instead of allowing more and more states to innovate and lower the healthcare costs, unfortunately, Democrats are of the mindset that Washington knows best, not our states. States can't be trusted, apparently. They want to limit the ability of states to innovate on behalf of their citizens. And this type of top-down command and control government knows best approach is what leads to policies like the Democrats' ultimate goal, a one-size-fits-all government takeover of healthcare. A vote in support of their bill is a vote against innovation, against lowering costs, against your constituents, your legislature, your governor, your state insurance commissioner, on and on and on. That's what you're doing if you vote for this. A vote against the bill is actually a vote for the people. So, Mr. Chair, I encourage my colleagues to oppose this partisan gimmick, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves.
Mr.
The
Chairman,
gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I now yield a minute and a half to the sponsor of the bill, Ms. Custer from New Hampshire.
The
Thank you for-
gentlelady from New Hampshire is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you for yielding, Chairman Pallone, and thank you for your guidance and leadership on the Energy and Commerce Committee as we advance critical legislation this week to stabilize the Affordable Care Act and drive down prescription drug costs for all Americans. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of my legislation, H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. As a patient with a pre-existing condition myself, I rise today to stand with over 52 million Americans and over 200,000 Granite Staters who live with pre-existing conditions every single day. And they could have been denied access to health care prior to passage of the Affordable Care Act, and many were. While we recognize we need to strengthen and stabilize the ACA, we should equally accept the principle that nobody should be denied coverage because of a pre-existing condition. When you think about it, asthma, allergies, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, just go right through the alphabet. Having a child even, any of these are pre-existing conditions. And in my home state of New Hampshire and across this country, opioid and alcohol addiction are pre-existing conditions. Every week, and again here today, we've heard Republicans in the House Energy and Commerce Committee say, oh, of course, we want to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. And yet, at every step, this administration is trying to sabotage the consumer protection guardrails that are in the ACA. Would you yield one more?
Has expired.
Another 30 seconds.
The gentlelady is
Including
recognized for an
fighting
additional 30
in
seconds.
court for the total elimination of the Affordable Care Act with absolutely no replacement. An important piece of the Affordable Care Act, Section 1332, created the state innovation waivers, which provide states with flexibility in implementing the ACA, as long as plans remain comprehensive, affordable, and accessible. However, the Trump administration recently issued guidance encouraging states to promote junk health plans through this waiver in order to circumvent essential health benefits and protections for pre-existing conditions. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm now delighted to yield 2 minutes to a very important member of our Energy and Commerce Committee, Mr. WALBERG from Michigan. 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the lead Republican. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in opposition to H.R. 986. I would give it its titled name, but it's yet another misleading effort that has nothing to do with the title of the bill. House Republicans fully support protections, and I make it clear, for patients with pre-existing conditions. I know that my Democrat colleagues and friends want to continue using the mantra that works so well politically without fact, truth, or reality during the election. We've gone beyond that now. Republicans support protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. These patients deserve peace of mind and safeguards from being treated unfairly. That's always been a priority of ours, and it will continue to be. But that's not what the bill before us today would do. H.R. 986 can be summed up in 3 words: Washington knows best. The bill eliminates flexibility at the state level, taking away options for states to innovate and bring down health care premiums. The high and rising cost of health care is a significant concern for patients and families in my district. We need to focus on solutions, not politics. We need to focus on solutions to provide relief from increasing costs, encourage choice and competition, expand access to quality care, and maintain important, and I make it very clear here again, important protections for patients with pre-existing conditions. We have the ideas to do that. We have the amendments that would put that forward and make this bill of something important to people with pre-existing conditions. But that's not being allowed today. And so let's stop playing political games with a bill title and a title like this, and instead focus on patient-centered solutions. I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield a minute and a half now to Ms. DeGette, who chairs our Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee.
The gentle lady is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank you, Chair, for yielding, and I rise in strong support of the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. Frankly, if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle were so firm in their commitment to protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions, they would support this bill, because all it says is Section 1332 will not stop the protections that we have under current law. The Trump administration guidance that allows states to undermine the pre-existing condition provisions of the ACA is frankly in clear violation of congressional intent. And so let's be clear about something. When we say we're going to protect people with pre-existing conditions, we actually mean it. And that's exactly what this legislation does. So I would welcome support from my friends on the other side of the aisle. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, over 750,000 people just in my little state of Colorado would be at risk of losing their health care coverage if it wasn't for the protections of the ACA. And the administration's repeated attempts to take the protections away from people and deny them the right to obtain health care coverage is actually the difference for many of them between life and death. We're not going to let this happen. This Congress is going to make sure that the goals of the ACA to give full health care coverage to every American, including people with pre-existing conditions, is going to be preserved. We've come too far to turn back the clock now. I'm glad that we have this bill on the floor now. I want to thank my colleague, Ms. Custer, for sponsoring it, and I urge every member of this body to support it. I yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's now a privilege to recognize our pharmacist on the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the so-called Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. Mr. Speaker, this is a misnomer. A misnomer is defined as a wrong or inaccurate name or designation, and that is what the title of this bill is. It is wrong. I join my colleagues on the Republican side in supporting protections for people with preconditions. In fact, it was one of the first votes in Congress that we took this year and was defeated by my colleagues across the aisle. This bill, which is ironically, as I say, misnamed because it doesn't actually protect pre-existing conditions, would take steps to actually roll back state efforts to innovate and lower premiums for Americans across the country. One issue I often hear from my constituents about is the cost of health care coverage and the lack of options available under Obamacare. These waivers would allow for new strategies to address high premiums that so many people are facing. In fact, of the states that created their own reinsurance programs, they saw on average a nearly 20% drop in premiums, with one state seeing a drop as high as 43.4%. As states continue to grapple with high insurance costs, they have looked up to these innovative waivers for opportunities to bring about new ideas that help people, not remove options and opportunities. We all know that there's an issue with affordability of insurance in many areas. And it should be known that this isn't as though it's just more conservative states moving forward with these reinsurance programs. States like New Jersey, where the chairman is from, Minnesota and Maryland have seen the benefits of this. That's why I urge my colleagues to give states the flexibility they need to reduce premiums and to vote no on this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield now a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from Illinois, who chairs our Consumer Protection Subcommittee.
The gentlelady is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, I believe that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are standing up and saying what they would like to see, and that is to protect people with pre-existing conditions. The problem with what they're telling the American people is that what they are proposing does not protect people with pre-existing conditions. I know when I first came to Congress as a woman, being a woman was a pre-existing condition. There were a lot of things that weren't covered because we were women until we passed the Affordable Care Act. While the Republicans are talking about protecting such people, they are supporting a lawsuit right now that once again would undo all of the Affordable Care Act, sweeping out with them protection for pre-existing conditions. But the other key word to listen to is flexibility. They are talking about allowing up to 4 years of policies that states could enact that do not cover the whole panoply of things that the Affordable Care Act covers and could exclude even protection for pre-existing conditions. That is not flexibility. That is taking away benefits for people. People, you can sign up for one of these, what we call junk policies, and you're perfectly well, and then all of a sudden you have some kind of an illness that, guess what, is not covered and won't be covered because by then you'll have a pre-existing condition. The legislation Democrats have for you today would protect pre-existing conditions, no questions, period, end of story. Thank you.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, for 2 minutes to speak on this matter.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to shed light on a very deceptive practice and the reason the American people refer to politics in Washington as the swamp, and that's giving bills names that not only have nothing to do with the legislation, but actually mislead the American people to believe it's something that it's not. This Democrat bill being considered today, entitled The Protection of the American People with Pre-Existing Condition Act, has absolutely nothing to do with pre-existing conditions and protecting people with pre-existing conditions. This bill actually prevents a policy that allows states to have the freedom and flexibility to provide for their citizens' health care needs. And where they have exercised that flexibility, we've seen an average of 20% in the reduction of health care costs. There are laws on the books, Mr. Speaker, passed by Democrats and Republicans alike that prevent and punish people and companies who participate in such false advertising. In fact, there's a good reason the FTC has strong truth in advertising laws and strictly enforces them against misleading and deceptive practices because it hurts people, it hurts consumers, and it actually, in this case, compromises the American people's trust. Mr. Speaker, the American people are sick and tired of political games. They're tired of politicians and their duplicity. They're tired, Mr. Speaker, of their elected representatives deceiving them. That's what this is. So I encourage my colleagues to not vote for this bill that takes the American people as fools and preys on their fears. I encourage both sides to stand in opposition of this bill, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield now 1 minute to our majority leader, the gentleman from Maryland.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman, Mr. Pallone, for the extraordinary leadership he has shown on this issue and so many others, and for his being an original drafter and sponsor of the Affordable Care Act. You know, I'm sitting here and I'm listening to speaker after speaker after speaker tell me that this doesn't protect pre-existing conditions. Of course it does. But those are people who not only didn't want to protect pre-existing conditions, they wanted to repeal the whole bill. They wanted to kick 20 million people off health insurance. Give me a break. Your crocodile tears are not hopefully deluding anybody. You're against the Affordable Care Act. We get that. And this administration has done everything they can think of to undermine the Affordable Care Act. and has had an adverse effect on the ability of Americans to get health insurance at a price that they can afford. Mr. Speaker, over the past few years, congressional Republicans and the Trump administration have engaged in a dangerous campaign to repeal, undermine, and dismantle the Affordable Care Act. Now, depending upon how long they've been here, they may well have voted over 60 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. All of it. Pre-existing conditions and everything else. Through executive actions and lawsuits, they've sabotaged the law and fueled uncertainty in health insurance markets in the process. They have a suit right now which wants to effectively repeal the entire Affordable Care Act that the Attorney General of the United States and the President of the United States are supporting. So spare me these crocodile tears about how this bill doesn't protect the pre-existing conditions. It does, but you don't care whether it does or not. They want to know the protections, the people want to know that the protections for those with pre-existing conditions won't disappear. That tens of millions of Americans won't be made effectively uninsurable and lose their coverage. There are very few of us in this chamber or in the gallery who don't have some sort of pre-existing condition. And we Democrats are committed to making sure that that will not preclude people from getting health insurance. In the first days of the Congress, we took action to do what the Trump administration's Justice Department has refused to do: defend the law in court. We're taking that action. Instead, the Trump administration is seeking to overturn the entire law, including the ban on denying coverage for those with pre-existing conditions. Now, the Republicans did pass a bill when they were in charge. They sent it over to the Senate. They had a big, and I know other people have talked about that, a big celebration at the White House. And the president embraced the bill. And some 10 days later, he said, no, it is a mean bill. President of the United States embraced it. 10 days later, it is a mean bill. Overturning the law means that the end of popular provisions like a ban on forcing women to pay more for the same coverage as men, or allowing those under age 26 to be covered under their parents' policy. The administration's lawsuit would also bring back out-of-pocket costs for preventive care and screenings. We want to encourage preventive care. Why? It saves money and saves lives. Most egregiously, it would kick 20 million Americans off health insurance coverage who were able to get covered because of the Affordable Care Act. Last month, the House passed a resolution written by Colin Allred, our new member from Texas, condemning that lawsuit, which would repeal the Affordable Care Act, and reiterating the importance of protecting Americans' access to quality, affordable care. Yesterday, the House took another step by passing bipartisan bills, which Mr. Pallone brought to the floor, to help speed up the process of bringing the cost of generic drugs down and not prescription costs up. And today we have a bill to overturn the Trump administration's guidance that sabotages the Affordable Care Act by allowing substandard plans. Are they cheaper? They are. But in the end, they're much more expensive because the coverage is minimal. The effects of such a rule is to drive up prices for those with pre-existing conditions. That wasn't the intent of the Affordable Care Act, which aimed to make coverage affordable for all Americans. Next week, we will continue focusing on health care by considering additional legislation to help Americans access quality, affordable coverage. I urge my colleagues on both sides. Some of you have said you want to protect pre-existing conditions. Some of you have said that. If you believed it, then you need to vote for this bill. You need to do something to protect those with pre-existing conditions. Today's vote is your opportunity to do so. I want to thank Representative Custer, who's on the floor with us today, for introducing this legislation, and again, Chairman Pallone for bringing it to the floor. House Democrats will continue, as we pledged to do in this last campaign, and as the people voted for us, expecting us to do, is to protect the Affordable Care Act, protect their ability to get insurance notwithstanding a pre-existing condition, protect their families, protect them, and make America better. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make a couple of comments. My friend from Maryland, and he is my friend, is always quite poignant and eloquent in his remarks. But what we're debating here today is a bill that is misnamed, that doesn't do what it says it's going to do. But what we do know is 1332 waivers work, and my state took advantage of that 1332 waiver and reduced insurance premiums by 6%. The great state of Maryland, I was just looking at some data, Mr. Chairman, they had about 181,500 in the enrollment year that they used a 1332 waiver. This year in the individual market, their costs for premiums, individual market percent decrease 43.4%. Now, let me finish. I bet you would, but we know overall 19.9% across the country, because you're able to take some of this money, put it together, have a reinsurance program. Maine's done it, Maryland's done it, Oregon's done it. These are things that work. The complaint I get, my friend from Maryland, is people at home say, I maybe have access to coverage now, but I can't afford the premium. Or if I can afford the premium, I can't afford to get sick because the out-of-pocket costs are so high. And they're now falling off. And later in the debate, I'll share some data that's been published this week showing people who literally walk away from health care because they can't afford it. That should be our common mission and goal. And when it comes to protecting people with pre-existing conditions, I introduced legislation, tried to get a vote on it every chance I've had, that would lock into law pre-existing condition protections, regardless of what this federal lawsuit's outcome is in Texas. We should do that. That'd be an easy vote. We could all vote for it. But Democrats won't let us bring it to the floor. With that, I would yield 2 minutes. The gentleman from Oklahoma.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, let's be honest. We're not here to solve a problem today. We're not here to change anything today. The bill will do nothing to help people with pre-existing conditions. Something not many people know about me is my family's history with spina bifida. I had an older sister about 13 months older than me who died 2 hours after birth because of spina bifida. My younger sister, who will turn 50 later this month, has lived her entire life as a spina bifida survivor, spending the first 6 months of her life enduring many surgeries. My mother knew that my sister was going to be born with that very birth defect that took the life of her first child. My sister had her first daughter, Kristen, who was born with a devastating spina bifida condition. During the pregnancies, my mother knew about my sister's birth defect, and my sister knew of Kristen's condition. In spite of that knowledge, their lives were not aborted. Kristen has a son who just turned 10. In spite of being in a wheelchair for her entire life of 30 years, Kristen has been an awesome mom to Daniel. Daniel will have an incredible story to tell about his life because his great-grandmother and his grandmother did not seek abortions to terminate the lives of their, quote, less than perfect children. He is alive today, and I'm confident he will have an incredible impact on those around him. These aren't nameless, faceless people we're talking about. This is my sister, my niece, and my family. These pre-existing conditions have had a massive impact on my life and the lives of my family. These messaging bills are pointless. People need help, not our talking points. Our goal should be success. We should aim to write legislation that has a shot to become law and will change people's lives for the better. The aim of H.R. 986 is not to protect Americans with pre-existing conditions, but to interfere with the president's ability to govern. These are real people and real problems that we're ignoring. I believe that life is precious. Every life is worth protecting. We have a lot of work to do, and it's time to stop talking and act. That is what we were elected to do here. Mr. Speaker, the American people are tired of these political games. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield now a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui.
Gentlewoman is recognized for a minute.
Thank you very much. I
And a
rise
half.
today as a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act, which prohibits the Trump administration from promoting the sale of junk insurance plans that do not fully protect Americans with pre-existing conditions. Today, we are taking a critical step to reverse a damaging Trump administration policy. With the Affordable Care Act, we sought to ensure that all people covered in the same area are charged the same premium as everyone else, regardless of their health status. Women cannot be denied coverage or charged more simply because they are a woman. And more Americans now have the freedom to start their own business or pursue work in a gig economy without fear of losing coverage for pre-existing condition, coverage which before the ACA was often tied to employer plans. In California, we've taken a stance against the Trump administration's sabotage of the ACA by protecting consumers from the sale of junk plans, but not every state can follow our lead. This legislation protects basic fairness and access to health care for all Americans, not just those living in states that have sought aggressive reforms, changes, and improvements to the law. We now have a real opportunity to protect and build on the ACA's success, and I'm immensely pleased to be able to support such efforts on the floor today. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I now am honored to recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Marshall, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. The lengths that my colleagues across the aisle are willing to go to mislead the public and increase the political divide over health care is shameful and embarrassing. H.R. 986, which I refuse to call by its name, makes a mockery of Americans with pre-existing conditions. Mr. Speaker, I practiced obstetrics for over 25 years. And you know what the most common pre-existing condition is? It's pregnancy. I came to Congress to protect people with pre-existing condition and to help patients. H.R. 586 does just the opposite. H.R. 586 prevents innovation, it drives the cost of health care up, and will cause fewer people to have health care. Let me be crystal clear about this, Mr. Speaker. This bill has absolutely nothing to do with people with pre-existing conditions. That's why I'm proud to join Congressman Walden and shed light on this deceptive bill that Democrats are pushing. Under current law, states do not have the authority to waive pre-existing conditions using the Section 1332 innovation waiver. It's that simple. Section 1332 waivers are working, and contrary to the Democrats' claims, patients are raving about the 1332 waivers for reinsurance. These waivers give states flexibility to provide Americans with affordable health care options. And in the 7 states using these waivers, premiums have gone down by an average of 20%. They went down 20%, with Maryland achieving 43% premium reduction. So I stand here today to discuss the facts and not the fiction. The 2018 guide from the president is making the process easier, helping states pursue innovation strategies that will help more people get coverage while delivering quality coverage people can actually afford and use. Most of us, including the president, are working towards a better healthcare future for all Americans, where patients and families, not bureaucrats in Washington, are in control of their own healthcare decisions. I ask that my colleagues across the aisle stop the partisan politics and come together to develop real healthcare policy solutions. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields.
And I reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield a minute and a half now to the gentleman from Vermont, a member of the committee.
The gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Chairman, if we want to level with the American people, let's acknowledge something. We have a difference of opinion on health care. When we passed the Affordable Care Act, it provided the first-time protection for people who have a pre-existing condition. Every single one of my colleagues on the Republican side voted against that. And then spent the next several years 69 times voting to get rid of the protection for pre-existing conditions. And then when they were in the majority, the first opportunity they had, they passed a bill out of the House to take away the protection for pre-existing conditions. And thank you, Senator John McCain, for protecting the American people. Every single opportunity to stand up and protect people who are sick, who lost their job but were sick and wanted to get insurance, you voted no, we voted yes. You're talking now about waivers. I like waivers. We've benefited in Vermont, but not this waiver. You pass this waiver, you are going to wave goodbye to the protection that we fought long and hard for pre-existing conditions. We fought for your families. We fought for our families. We fought for all American families. What kind of world is it if you're sick, you can't get health care? That's what's at stake now. That should never be in debate. And we will not back down on protecting people from pre-existing conditions. We will not back down on assaults on Medicare. We will not back down on assaults in Medicaid. Mr. Speaker, let us pass this bill and continue to protect Americans' health care. I yield back.
Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman
Chair.
from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. I would just say to my friend, the biggest assault on Medicare is the Democrats' proposal to do Medicare for all. We know it would cost $32 trillion, double personal and corporate income taxes, and require, I just met with our hospitals yesterday, 40% reduction in their payments. They're not sure how they would survive. They told me most hospitals in America go bankrupt under the Democrats' proposal. With that, I would recognize the gentleman from the Ways and Means Committee, the powerful Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Reed, to speak on this matter for the next 2 minutes.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to the bill before us, but as the father of a type 1 diabetic who agrees with the basis of the law of the Affordable Care Act that says pre-existing condition must be protected in every health insurance plan going forward. We should be celebrating together that that reform is now the law of the land. And I would hope my colleagues would take yes for an answer. But what is being proposed today potentially jeopardizes that protection. Because what you're proposing today is to take away the abilities of the states to comply with the law of the land, to protect those pre-existing conditions in a way that allows the states to innovate, to drive health insurance premiums down as the law protects those with pre-existing conditions. This is not a political game. You are talking about real Americans. You are talking about kids like my son, who is a type 1 diabetic. And if this law, as proposed, becomes the law of the land, you potentially increase insurance premiums on millions of Americans because you take away that innovation ability of the states to deliver the protections of pre-existing condition reform, but lower premiums at the same time. So I stand in strong objection to this political effort from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. And rather than engage in politics, I join with the silent majority of Americans that say, you know what? Enough is enough of politics. Get to the real work of the people and lower healthcare costs for everyone. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman yields.
Could I just inquire about how much time we have on each side, please?
The gentleman from Oregon has 9 minutes remaining. And the gentleman from New Jersey has 16 and a half minutes remaining.
We'll reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield 1.5 minutes now to the gentlewoman from New York, the Vice Chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee.
The gentlelady is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank our chairman for yielding the time. I thank Congresswoman Custer for her leadership. As Vice Chair of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and co-sponsor of H.R. 986, I am proud to stand with my colleagues in support of the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019. Healthcare is a right. In the 21st century, everyone must have the right to the best quality and affordable healthcare insurance when they need it most. This human right must not only be limited to healthy individuals, but rather the human right to health care must be available to every American who has ever been ill at any time or is born with a pre-existing condition. No American should be penalized for a medical condition that started before the individual's health care coverage benefits went into effect. Passage of the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act would rescind the 1332 guidance issued by the Trump administration, which weakens coverage and undermines the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions. Our friends on the other side of the aisle made more than 70 failed attempts to replace and repeal the Affordable Care Act between 2011 and 2017. Mr. Speaker, we must do the right thing and enact legislation that strengthens the standards of quality health care affordability, comprehensiveness, and coverage. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 986. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'd yield, Mr. Chairman, in a minute and a half now to the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Dingell.
Gentlewoman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in support of protecting people with pre-existing conditions. Not that long ago, hardworking people who did everything right would be denied insurance coverage just because they had diabetes or asthma or they wanted to start a family. We passed the ACA and ended discrimination against people with pre-existing conditions. Millions of Americans were able to sign up for coverage for the first time in their lives. And millions who already had coverage knew it wouldn't be taken away from them. Remember the stories of people's insurance being canceled as they were being rolled into operating rooms. That was the truth. The ACA has done a lot of good. Could we work to improve it? Yes. And I'll work with any Republican or Democrat on those efforts. But when this Congress and this administration attempt to roll back protections for people with pre-existing conditions, I will always stand against those policies. 2 years ago, last week, House Republicans passed a bill to rescind the whole ACA and take health care away from 20 million Americans. Because Americans spoke up, that bill failed. The administration's recent Section 1332 guidance would let states I'm proud to co-sponsor Representative Custer's bill. Health care should be affordable to every American.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'll continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield now a minute and a half to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byer.
Gentleman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise today to speak in support of H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. Frankly, Mr. Chairman, I'm confused. I serve on the Ways and Means Committee, and a few weeks ago we had a long, lively hearing on the need to preserve the pre-existing conditions protection created by the ACA, and I was impressed that every member of the Ways and Means Committee, Democrat and Republican, spoke passionately about this protection. Every one. We emerged from that hearing with a clear bipartisan consensus that we would never again condemn Americans who have suffered from diabetes or cancer or heart disease or epilepsy to unaffordable insurance and perhaps an early death. But today, my Republican friends are ready to vote against the only bill this year to keep the Trump administration from gutting the pre-existing exclusion. They argue that no, this is not what CMS is trying to do, yet this is exactly what would happen when short-term insurance plans in the various states are given the opportunity to do so. That's why virtually every organization that protects human health supports this bill and is against the CMS action. States want waivers, states want to innovate, yes, and this bill won't keep them from innovating or keep them from getting waivers. But remember what states did before the Affordable Care Act, when there was no prohibition against higher costs for pre-existing conditions or no insurance. So if what they say is indeed true, there's no harm voting yes for this bill. States will still be able to innovate as long as they don't violate the pre-existing conditions exclusion. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield now a minute and a half to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address for the minute and a half.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the chairman very much. Just a second on memory lane for those of us who were here for the Affordable Care Act, where dozens of our committees, including the Judiciary Committee, heard the pain of people whose family members had died because they had no access to health care and or they had junk policies. I rise today with the strongest of support for H.R. 986 and thank my good friend, Annie Custer, for her great leadership and indicate that since the Affordable Care Act, and I know that we are now looking at Medicare for All and many others, my view of it is yes, so that we all can have access to health care, that it is in fact sure that this bill that we now have that is being attacked by the Trump administration in the Fifth Circuit right now because of my Attorney General attacking the Affordable Care Act, Texas saw a decrease or national decrease of the uninsured from 14.8 to 8.8. Now this legislation, which is to turn back the Trump guidance on the issue of waivers is vital because we have lower cost for health insurance because of the ability for people to access and be taken care of with the Affordable Care Act when they have pre-existing condition. Sickle cell, triple negative breast cancer, diabetes, all plaguing my constituency, insulin costs going through the roof. With this legislation or guidance that Trump has put in place, it will be worse. It'll be compounded. The rates will go up and people suffering from pre-existing conditions, including pregnancy, will not get the policies that are low cost. They will not have the comprehensive costs that will include mental health. And certainly they will see a reverse of them being able to have coverage for pre-existing condition. That is the civil rights of healthcare. Pre-existing condition must be protected. I rise to enthusiastically support H.R. 986, and I demand that the Trump administration stop taking away the constitutional rights in everything and denying people their right to good health care. Enough is enough. Let us support this legislation. I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve my time, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield now a minute and a half to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Speaker, after 2 years of the Trump administration trying and failing in Congress to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they've gone to Plan B. Plan B is to use the administrative agencies, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the court system as a way of trying to accomplish what they could not accomplish through the House and the Senate and the 115th Congress. Today, we are dealing with one of those efforts, which was an order that was issued in October of last year, issuing new guidelines for state waivers from the Affordable Care Act, repealing the Obamacare guardrails that made sure that patient protections would not be affected by such waivers. For example, protecting people with pre-existing condition, the elimination of lifetime caps on health insurance, and also the protections that were built in for essential health benefits, which defined real health care, not the cheap health care that was being sold before the ACA was enacted. An intervening event occurred since last October, which is we had an election. It was the largest midterm turnout since 1914. We had a new majority that was elected with a plurality of 10 million votes. larger than any flip election in the past, any wave election in the past. And the number one issue from the voters was health care and protecting their patient rights to affordable and comprehensive benefits. Mr. Speaker, we are here today debating an issue which the patient groups have stepped up across the board, who represent people with chronic illnesses, with expensive illnesses like cancer, saying vote for this legislation to overturn the Trump orders that they are trying to get through that they could not get through the U.S. Congress. Vote for this bill.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve my time, Mr. Chair.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire how much time remains on each side?
Both sides have 9 minutes remaining.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I wanted to mention this issue of reinsurance. Though some of the Republicans have brought up the fact that in the last few years, under the Obama administration, actually before President Trump, that certain states, I believe there are 8 now, including my own, that have applied for 1332 waivers because they wanted to put in place reinsurance programs. And I want to assure everyone that those types of waivers that are granted for reinsurance would continue, and that this legislation in no way impacts that. Keep in mind, we're not opposed to 1332 waivers, but pursuant to the Affordable Care Act, which I helped draft, those waivers, when granted, have to maintain affordability, the comprehensiveness of coverage, and keep the same number of people insured as under the ACA. Now, when my state and others have applied for waivers for reinsurance programs, it's because the ACA reinsurance funding was discontinued at some point under the original bill. And those states want to, among other things, make sure that there's competitiveness in the marketplace by providing some kind of reinsurance or risk protection so that more insurers come into the marketplace in those states and create more competition and lower prices. So when you ask the federal government for a reinsurance waiver, you are still maintaining affordability, probably are making things even more affordable because of competition. You're still maintaining the comprehensiveness of the coverage because you have to provide policies that have all the essential benefits, and you're keeping the same number of people insured. In fact, what you're probably doing is having more people insured. The difference between that and the Section 1332 guidance that the Trump administration is now putting forth is that none of those things are guaranteed under the waivers that the Trump administration is proposing with their guidance. For one thing, they're saying you can sell a junk plan that doesn't have hospitalization, that doesn't have essential benefits. So you violate the Section 3032 provision. You also end up having fewer people insured because the Trump administration says you don't have to have the same number of people covered. All you have to do is have access. And then lastly, affordability. Oh, sure, they'll argue that somehow it's more affordable because a junk plan doesn't cost as much, but that's sort of a misnomer because the comprehensiveness of the coverage disappears. So I want everyone to understand that in no way a state that applies to have reinsurance as part of their program and gets a waiver, that is in no way impacted by what we're proposing here today with Ms. Custer's bill. In fact, reinsurance reinforces the very things that 1332 waivers are seeking to guarantee. So that is a very false bit of information that my colleagues on the other side are trying to put out here today. And I just wanted to explain that. And with that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'll continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I would now yield a minute and a half to Ms. Slotkin.
Gentlewoman is recognized for a minute and a half.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Protecting People with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. For me, this issue is particularly personal. It is a major reason why I ended up coming here to Congress. And I believe that the sabotage, the attempts at legislating out protections for people with pre-existing conditions is something that is just out of touch with the American people, certainly in Michigan's 8th District. It's particularly personal to me because of my mom. My mom passed away in 2011 from ovarian cancer, and when she was diagnosed, she did not have health care. She had struggled with healthcare her entire life. She had breast cancer as a young 31-year-old mom. So for the rest of her life, she had a pre-existing condition. My parents divorced and she lost her job. And because of that pre-existing condition, she could not afford health insurance. So she went 5.5 years without. No checkup, no gynecological exam. We finally got her health insurance, my brother and I. It was $1,000 a month and a $10,000 deductible, her highest bill in Detroit. In 2009, without us knowing, she let it lapse. And 2 months later, she walked into an ER and was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. So I'm sure my colleagues around the room know what it's like to have a loved one get a terminal diagnosis. Your life, as you know it, explodes. And that same week and that same month that our lives were exploding was the same week and the same month we spent filling out the paperwork for her to declare bankruptcy. I think no matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat or an independent, it is essential that we support people with pre-existing conditions, and I urge my colleagues to do so. Thank you very much.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Reserve my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also, once again, would like to yield myself such time as I may consume. Still waiting for one of our other speakers.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I also wanted to respond to my colleague, the ranking member, who I respect a great deal, but he has several times today, as well as in committee, and is his representative at the Rules Committee, talked about this amendment that he has on pre-existing conditions. First of all, the reality is that the ACA guarantees people coverage with pre-existing conditions. The problem here is not that we need to restate that, but that the Section 1332 guidance that the Trump administration has proposed would undermine it. Now, on its surface, Mr. Walden's amendment, appears to maintain protections for pre-existing conditions. But again, that's not the issue, because he's not getting rid of the guidance that the Trump administration has put forward under 1332. So what does that mean? It means that even with his amendment, the Trump administration, under their guidance, would allow insurance companies to not offer basic services such as hospitalization, maternity coverage, mental health, and substance abuse disorders. Insurance companies would no longer have to offer these benefits to people with pre-existing conditions who would need those benefits. The bill, or his bill, Mr. Walden's bill or amendment, also does not include prohibitions on annual and lifetime limits, which are critical protections for individuals with pre-existing conditions. These limits, which were commonplace prior to the ACA, are a threat to the life and health of individuals with serious medical conditions. And the Walden Amendment would allow insurance companies to charge women more than men and put a significant financial burden on older Americans. So we're not interested in these half measures that will leave Americans worse off. So at this point, I don't have as much time as you, and I would like now to yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Harder.
Thank you. Thank you. I have an amendment on the desk.
The gentleman is recognized.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Well, I rise today in support of my amendment nonetheless. My legislation would simply require the federal government to issue an expert analysis of the impact of junk plans on mental health care access. People deserve access to mental health care, and we need to know how many people will lose that access if these junk plans become used more widely. That's exactly what my amendment would tell us. People who are struggling with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, or substance use disorder deserve coverage. We're talking about real people in our communities who need help, and they should get it. And that's especially true because of the stigma surrounding mental health issues. If your friends tell you, if you tell your friends that you have cancer, they tell you to get help. If you tell your friends you have depression, they tell you to tough it up or go to the gym. And without access to mental health care, a lot of people end up self-medicating. That's why we have to make sure that they're covered with real insurance, not junk plans. These plans are a scam. I heard a horror story from a woman in Stanislaus County about her family's experience with the junk plan before the Affordable Care Act. Her daughter went off to school and got cheap university-sponsored insurance. After a couple years, she had a mental health issue present, but she was completely denied coverage for the treatment that she needed. Even though she'd paid premiums for years, she wasn't covered, and her family had to pay thousands of dollars out of pocket. Years later, they're still paying it off today, more than 10 years after her mental health episode. And that's a common story because only about half of these plans cover mental health care, and only about a third cover substance use disorder. And that's a huge problem for people in my district in the Central Valley, especially for young people. It's in people's 20s that they start showing signs of a lot of mental health problems, and this often coincides with the development of substance use disorders. People who turn 26 have to get off their parents' insurance. They pick the cheapest thing they can find. And if we don't pass this amendment, millions of people who have similar stories will be denied coverage for mental health issues when they need it most. That is a scam. That's what my amendment demands. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
This time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time does each side have?
Oregon has 9 minutes. Gentleman from New Jersey has 1 minute.
Okay. Does the gentleman have any other speakers? Okay. Then I yield myself such time as I may consume. So,
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me address a few issues. First of all, my friend from New Jersey, and he is my friend, referenced my amendment. It's unfortunate that we can't debate my amendment on the floor because the Democrats that control the Rules Committee wouldn't allow my amendment to be considered. Nor would they allow us to bring a bill to the floor that I've authored that has more than 100 co-sponsors that would make sure that pre-existing conditions are protected in case the court decision in Texas goes against the ACA and wipes out those protections. See, this would be an insurance policy for people with pre-existing condition in public law. We could do that today. And if it has some shortcomings, then let's have a markup on this bill and work that out. I care deeply about pre-existing condition protection. I fought for it as a legislator. I helped create the high-risk pools in Oregon back in the late 80s and early 90s. I've supported every step of the way. Let me again quote from the Department of Human Services. We asked them, and they wrote back to me about protection for pre-existing condition. And Seema Verma, the administrator, said in her letter to me, let me be very clear, the 2018 guidance does nothing to erode, and I'm going to use Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, PPACA, pre-existing condition provisions, which cannot be waived under Section 1332. So they cannot do that. They cannot waive those protections under 1332. Section 1332 does not permit states to waive Public Health Service Act requirements, such as guaranteed availability and renewability of health insurance, the prohibition on using health status to vary premiums, and the prohibition on pre-existing condition exclusions. Furthermore, a Section 1332 waiver cannot be approved that might otherwise undermine these requirements. This administration stands committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. That's the head of CMS. It's her agency that approves 1332 waivers. There have been no waivers so far approved under this guidance. And that is what she tells us in writing, period, because of the information that's being sent around. We do know that 7 states have taken advantage of the prior 1332 process, and it has yielded more affordable insurance premiums for American citizens. Now, I find it curious. My state has been very progressive in these areas, and when I was in the state legislature, I helped try and expand access to affordable health care. We had to come to Washington, get a waiver for the Oregon Health Plan and Medicaid. And we looked at all kinds of different ways to get access to affordable health care, and I've never let up on that. I believe strongly in helping people with pre-existing condition. Like my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, my wife and I had a son who did not survive because of a heart condition. And we dealt with all of these issues leading up to his birth and eventual death. So I am fully committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. What we're arguing about here is health insurance affordable for Americans? And are there better ways, using states as laboratories, to innovate and bring down costs of care and costs of insurance? Because more of us are paying more out of our pocket than any time in our history. There was a very interesting story, which I'll put in the record for everyone to read. Data from the Kaiser Foundation this week that ran in a publication called Axios. And I just want to share some of what they found about what's really going on if you get outside of the Beltway here in Washington and talk to real people. And they evaluated people who had coverage under their employer, in this case, and had a chronic condition of some sort. It's not a small group. About half of Americans who have employer coverage, so that's half of 158 million, report that 6 in 10 in that group report they or a family member skipped or postponed medical care or prescription drugs they needed because of the costs, or they, in some cases, tried a home remedy. High deductibles make things worse. Among those with chronic conditions whose deductibles were at least $3,000 for an individual or $5,000 for a family, 3/4, Mr. Chairman, 3/4, 75% report skipping or postponing some type of care. And about half, 49%, say they or a family member had problems paying medical bills or difficulty affording their premiums, deductibles, or co-pays in the last year. So what states, including mine, including New Jersey, including Maryland, including Maine, and Alaska did was say, hey, Washington, D.C., give us just a little flexibility here. Let us come up with plans that may be more affordable. They did that under the prior rules. And rates went down on average 19.9%. Some states more, some less. Now, what happens when people can't afford to use their own insurance? Because that's happening with these deductibles at these high levels, let alone the premiums. The ripple effect on family budgets, according to this story in Axios, a substantial share of people reported taking measures such as increasing credit card debt, 28%, using up most of their savings, 26%, extra job, 19%, borrow money from family or friends, 14%. This is what we're trying to argue could be better taken care of. This is the issue that's being ignored by a Washington one-size-fits-all. So we protect people with pre-existing conditions, 1332 waivers, that law stays in effect, but we want to give states a little more flexibility to go after this to bring down the costs. Now, my friend from New Jersey and I, Mr. Chairman, are working together on some of these drug reforms so we can get drug costs down. I was at the White House today with the president on surprise billing, and I think we're going to work together on that issue, Mr. Chairman, so that no American consumer who follows the rules gets stuck with a surprise bill. What are you supposed to do? Wake up in the middle of the operation and say, hey, everybody in this room still on my plan? If you play by the rules, you shouldn't get stuck unfairly with a surprise bill. We're going to find a solution to that. My state came up with a way to do that already. Other states have other ideas, but we're going to protect consumers there as well. And we're going to drive down the cost of drugs. And we should continue to go after this issue of high cost of health care, because that's what Americans in my 20 town halls, and I don't think anybody in the House has done more. I've done 20 town halls this year. And in almost every one of them, they're asking about how do you get the costs down? 1332 waivers gave my state the opportunity to get costs down. And we should not impede that process. Now, we're going to debate a lot about these policies going forward. And if they're junk plans, then let's expose them for what they are. And let's pass Ms. Eshu's bill from, I think, last Congress that required more transparency and accountability so you don't have fraud and deception. Count me all in on that. There's a lot more we can do to drive down costs. And my legislation, again, that the Democrats refuse to bring up in committee or have on the floor would make sure, regardless of any lawsuit, people with pre-existing conditions continue to get covered. So irrespective of the court decisions, they'd get covered. If my bill were allowed to be voted on in the House, I guarantee you, might have some issues we need to work out. I'm happy to do that. But it'd pass. It'd become law. And this president is firmly committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. So we should do that. We should also have a hearing on the Medicare for All bill that some on the other side are promoting. I've asked for that. I know there was one in Rules Committee, but Energy and Commerce is the committee of jurisdiction for most of that. We've not seen that hearing yet. I hope in the future we will, because we should know the impact of wiping out Medicare Advantage plans, Medigap plans. I've been told TRICARE would go away. All private insurance would go away. And it would be a one-size-fits-all government-run system. And I'm worried about the delay in access to care. I'm worried about the access to the great new innovative drugs and procedures that we would lose in America. So, Mr. Speaker, I must oppose this underlying legislation. I remain committed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions, as do my colleagues on the Republican side. And then we ought to focus together, Mr. Chairman. We ought to focus together as a Congress to do the best thing for our constituents, which is bring the greatest leverage possible to reduce unnecessary costs in the healthcare system in America. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back and ask my colleagues to oppose this bill.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the problem is that nothing that my colleague on the Republican side says about his amendment and nothing that's in Seema Verma's letter will help the person with pre-existing conditions. The bottom line is that this 1332 guidance that the Trump administration has put forward allows junk plans to be sold so people with pre-existing conditions will not get the coverage they need. They can be charged more. They're not guaranteed that things like rescissions and lifetime limits don't go back into place. And so the problem that we face is we can't allow people with pre-existing conditions to suffer and not get coverage because they're going to be charged more or because they're not going to get the coverage they need by buying a junk plan. And if you really care about that and you want to make sure that people with pre-existing conditions really are guaranteed good coverage and can afford their coverage, then you have to vote for this bill, for Ms. Custer's bill. That's all we're saying here. I'm not saying that my colleague on the other side is not well-meaning, but nothing he has said will protect the people from pre-existing conditions from the problems with the Trump guidance. So I would ask my colleagues to support this bill. And Mr. Chairman, can I now ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from various nonprofit health organizations supporting the bill? There are two of them. And also, I'm placing into the record an exchange of letters between the chairman of the Committee on Energy and Commerce and the chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means on the bill, H.R. 986.
The gentleman's request will be covered under general leave. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No amendment to the bill shall be in order except those printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, and equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to the amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For that purpose, does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Langevin of Rhode Island.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Americans with disabilities have always faced significant barriers to health care. A decade ago, an insurer could charge a family an exorbitant amount to cover a child merely because the child had asthma. An insurer could tell an amputee that they would cover her medical equipment except her medical treatment except for the treatment related to her amputated limb. Or an insurer could flat out deny coverage to the victim of an accidental shooting at the age of 16 simply because he had a spinal cord injury. Essentially, insurers could legally discriminate against individuals with disabilities and face no consequences. That is absolutely outrageous, Mr. Chairman. Then the Congress finally passed the Affordable Care Act and started to bring those barriers down. For the first time, people with pre-existing health conditions, including the one in 4 Americans living with a disability, no longer had to worry about whether they would be denied comprehensive health insurance. Coverage of essential health benefits meant a mother with a traumatic brain injury could obtain rehabilitative services and learn how to walk. A man with Parkinson's could access medication to control his tremors. A child with a vision impairment could visit an eye doctor to prevent further vision loss. And this access to health care is vital because when Americans with disabilities are healthy, they can stay active with their families, pursue fulfilling careers, and engage in their communities. Unfortunately, the Trump administration is once again working to raise barriers to health coverage instead of working to eliminate them. The administration's October 2018 guidance encourages states to allow insurers to offer short-term limited duration plans that do not have to provide coverage of pre-existing conditions or essential health benefits. This means insurers offering these junk plans can discriminate against disabled individuals by charging astronomical prices, excluding necessary treatments from coverage, or denying an individual health insurance altogether. This is outrageous. If you're having deja vu, it's because this is exactly what was happening to Americans with disabilities before the passage of the Affordable Care Act. The amendment that I'm offering today makes clear exactly what people with disabilities have to lose if states act on the administration's guidance. I have spent my near 2 decades in Congress championing efforts to eliminate barriers to access and integration for people with disabilities and help my fellow Americans understand their great potential. But fundamentally, none of that means that matters if people with disabilities are not healthy because insurers deny them coverage to treat their conditions. The damage from the administration's guidance would be borne disproportionately by the disabilities community, and my amendment makes that clear. Whether someone is born with a disability, develops a disability, or becomes disabled due to an accident, that disability, I assure you, happened by chance, not by choice. Even the healthiest 30-year-old today could be in a car accident tonight and wake up with a lifelong disability tomorrow. And if that 30-year-old had one of these junk plans, much of that cost of that care would fall on his or her own shoulders, and they would be on their own. I had hoped that 9 years after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, I would no longer have to come here and defend the idea that quality, affordable health care is a right and not a privilege. But once again, here we are. Mr. Chairman, I support my friend, Congresswoman Custer's underlying legislation, and I ask my colleagues to support my amendment to make clear the damage the Trump administration's guidance would cause to people with disabilities. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just say that Section 1332 does not permit states to waive pre-existing condition protections, period. And I would again cite the guidance from the CMS director, Ms. Seema Verma, where she states that, and that will be in the record. Again, I think what we're trying to do here is give states more flexibility to bring down the cost of health insurance while following these guidelines as outlined. As I mentioned earlier in the debate, high deductibles are pricing people out of coverage. And by that, I mean they're walking away from getting the care that they need because they can't pay for it, or they're driving up their credit card debt, wiping out their savings. They're having to take another job. They're borrowing money from others. So what the Trump administration is trying to do is build on what the Obama administration created, 1332 waivers that have frankly been very successful in many, many states. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserved. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted, in reference to the gentleman Morgan's comments, state that these plans under the Obama administration were supposed to be very short in duration for a 3-month period, while individuals sought more comprehensive, appropriate health coverage according to their needs. It wasn't supposed to be a replacement for a good quality, affordable health care plan that would cover pre-existing conditions and essential health benefits to identify health problems early on in someone's in a potential lifelong or a very serious illness with long-term health consequences that could potentially even lead to one's losing one's life. So it took what was supposed to be a stopgap and now they're trying to make that a permanent plan, and that's just wrong. With that, Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 116-1. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Brown of Maryland.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise in support
Gentleman
of
is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of the underlying bill that will preserve protections for hundreds of thousands of Marylanders and Americans who, like me, have a pre-existing condition. And I rise in support, of course, of my amendment to protect states who are acting to strengthen their insurance marketplaces, lower premiums, and expand access to high-quality care by preserving their reinsurance programs that they have established. For more than 2 years, the president, in concert with Republicans in Congress, have tried every trick in the book to undermine the Affordable Care Act. They tried repealing it, taking it to the courts, and now want to allow states to gut protections for those the Affordable Care Act helped most. These attacks jeopardize health care for Americans with chronic conditions like asthma, high blood pressure, and diabetes, and threaten to bankrupt thousands of families with a loved one who has fallen ill due to no fault of their own. It's not just bad policy, it's fundamentally cruel. That's why, in the face of this onslaught by the Trump administration to make the Affordable Care Act less effective, we must provide states with every tool in the toolbox to keep premiums down, while preventing the Trump administration from giving states the power to gut essential protections. I firmly believe that states should have the power and flexibility to innovate and find healthcare solutions that work best for them. The Affordable Care Act always envisioned a critical role for states. States design their own exchanges, shape their Medicaid programs, and take the lead in enforcing patient protections and reviewing rate increases. These waivers took on new importance after President Trump and the Republican Congress failed to repeal Obamacare and instead sought to undermine the Affordable Care Act by eliminating the requirement to obtain health insurance, ending cost-sharing payments for low-income individuals, passing regulations that encourage short-term and junk insurance, and defunding advertising and outreach during open enrollment. This sabotage has caused more families to pay higher premiums and fewer people able to get the high-quality care they deserve. States acted to counteract these efforts by establishing reinsurance programs and applying for state innovation waivers. Reinsurance programs protect insurers from very high, unpredictable medical expenses incurred by their members. Alaska, Minnesota, Oregon, Maine, Wisconsin, New Jersey, and my own state of Maryland have all received federal approval to establish reinsurance programs. These are the very programs my amendment seeks to protect. These programs work and meet the shared goal of making health insurance affordable and accessible to all Americans, including those with pre-existing conditions. Reinsurance programs have been able to cut premiums by 20% on average and save the federal government nearly $1 billion. Maryland saw the biggest savings, lowering individual premiums by more than 43%. These lower premiums will help entice younger and healthier individuals to get insurance, making health care more affordable for everyone. While we have a president in the White House and Republicans in Congress who have made health care prohibitively expensive and stripped protections for those who need it most, it is imperative that this Congress protect our partners on the state level who are working with us to protect health care for all Americans. My amendment would protect these innovative reinsurance programs and encourage more states to adopt them. I reserve my time, the balance of my time.
Oh,
For what
Mr.
purpose
Chairman?
does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
I'd like to claim time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not necessarily opposed to his amendment, but I do think it's important to talk about the issues that really matter when it comes to affordable health care. And again, when we talk about giving states the authority to innovate and to protect their citizens, we're for that. I come from a state that pioneered the Oregon Health Plan. I was there. I created a select committee when I was the Republican majority leader of the Oregon House, when we finally got the waiver from the federal government after a couple of years to actually implement the Oregon Health Plan. And it was very creative about how to hold down healthcare costs and expand coverage and do all those things. We've worked on a lot of different issues over the years. What we did with the president today, I think, is really important. And that is look at this issue of surprise billing. If you follow all the rules, you go to a hospital that's in your network, and let's say some provider gets sick in the night and they substitute somebody else that doesn't turn out to be in your network, and then weeks later you get an astronomical bill through no fault of your own. There was a parent down there whose daughter had I think, some sort of surgery, and the physician on the way out said, "Oh, by the way, I want you to just do a little urine test here, and we're going to run an analysis." So she did, left, and a period of time later got a bill for $17,000. Her dad's a doctor, and he how did this happen? Well, it turned out whoever did the test was not in the network of her insurance. She didn't know. What are you going to do? You had the whatever surgery she had, and on the way out, the doc says, "Hey, by the way, give us a little sample here. I just want to run a test because I got you on this drug, and I want to make sure it's all working right." $17,000 bill arrives a couple months later. And they were there with the president today in the Roosevelt Room on this bipartisan event. And her dad negotiated. He couldn't say what level, but it was certainly not what the insurer would have paid. You know what the insurer would have paid for that? In network, $100. $100. Said the test you can probably get done now for $25. $17,000 bill arrives. This is what's happening to Americans who have insurance. And that's why we've got to deal with the surprise billing issue. It's why we have to squeeze the juice out of the middle of the healthcare delivery system. We do all these great innovations, and Republicans led the effort on 21st century cures. We met with Dr. Francis Collins yesterday, extraordinary leader of NIH, longest serving president appointed under Obama, NIH director in the history of our country. And because of what we put forward to dramatically increase investment in NIH, Republicans led that effort, Fred Upton, but joined with Diana DeGette, Democrat out of Colorado, and a bunch of us. They are now finding cures. And Dr. Collins said yesterday, they've identified now 6,500 diseases, genetic diseases, where they now can figure out, I'll say, the misspelling of the DNA code. Some of you my colleagues may have seen on 60 Minutes, Dr. Collins talking about they think they found a cure for sickle cell anemia. And they found the misspelling, one letter misspelled in that big chain of DNA, that they were able to go in with our new technology, and some of it is a result of what we've done collaboratively here, and alter that letter. And they have these people now that there's no evidence of sickle cell in their blood platelets. 6,500 diseases they now know the misspelling. Now they got to figure out how to train your body using technology to have your own cells turned on in a little different way and go after these diseases. This is remarkable advances in life-saving medicines and treatments. We, I think, as a country, got to figure out how we pay for that. If each one of these individualized, our system's antiquated, doesn't deal with this effectively. We're going to figure that out, because a life-saving cure isn't going to cure a life if people can't afford to get the medicine. We also need to drill down on telehealth and telemedicine. One of our colleagues today was talking about mental health service. My district's bigger than any state east of the Mississippi, unless you have to count Lake Michigan with Michigan, which of course you do. And so telehealth really matters. And we're getting great results for our veterans and for our citizens using telehealth, but our providers don't often get paid for the service they provide over telehealth. Why? That's something we got to address. And you go one thing after another here, where we should be spending our valuable legislative time solving the problems that real Americans run into every day of the week. It's how do I pay the bill? You tell me I got insurance, and I do, and I pay a record. I don't know whose premium under Obamacare went down $2,500 a month. But I'll talk about this more, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. I join my colleague, the gentleman from Oregon, in acknowledging the great work that's happening in the state of Oregon, in New Jersey, in Maryland, in establishing these reinsurance programs. And it is my amendment that seeks to protect these very strong programs. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed.
Mr. Chair.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Request a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Presley of Massachusetts.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today in support of my amendment to H.R. 986, the Protecting Patients with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. Quality, affordable health care is a fundamental human right, period. No one should have to face financial ruin while they are fighting for their life. When people are using GoFundMe pages to pay their medical bills, when parents are burying their children who ration their insulin to pay their student loans, we know that we are in the midst of a moral crisis. And yet, we must contend with an administration that is determined to roll back these rights and protections. Each of us has loved ones whose lives are put in conditional jeopardy when we erode protections for pre-existing conditions. These efforts put lives at risk, and we're here today to fight back. In my district, the Massachusetts 7th, half of the residents are living with pre-existing conditions. Families are struggling with some of the highest per capita healthcare costs in the nation, even as they live in the shadow of some of the best healthcare institutions in the world. In my district, travel 3 miles from Back Bay to Roxbury, and life expectancy drops 30 years, 30. Since its implementation, the ACA has provided critical protections for the nearly 3 million residents of Massachusetts living with pre-existing conditions. Our families, our neighbors, our communities are depending on us to uphold the life-saving protections for people with pre-existing conditions, and we can do that today by passing H.R. 986. Mr. Chair, my amendment to H.R. 986 affirms that women's health care isn't optional. It is an essential benefit every plan must cover. At a time when more than 67 million American women and girls are living with a pre-existing condition, we cannot, no, we will not go backwards. At a time when life expectancy is declining because of gun violence, opioid use, and a maternal mortality crisis, we cannot afford to compromise on these essential services. Before the ACA, Mr. Chair, typical insurance plans consider maternity care a luxury benefit, and women consistently paid for more primary care than men. In fact, women who had given birth, had a C-section, were living with HIV or previous breast cancer diagnosis could be considered to have pre-existing conditions and denied coverage. Thanks to the ACA, many women who were previously uninsured gained health coverage, including vital access to preventative care. This administration's cruel and dangerous guidance would weaken these provisions and allow insurers to sell skimpy plans that can exclude coverage like maternity care and pediatric services. The ACA is our floor, not our ceiling. We must continue to fight for universal health care. We must continue to push for a healthcare system that meets the needs of the people that we represent. A healthcare system that sees all people, hears all people, and cares for all people in a way that promotes safety, dignity, and respect. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, and I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'll claim the time in opposition, although I'm not necessarily opposed to the gentlelady's amendment.
Without objection.
And I'll reserve my time at this time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts is recognized.
I yield.
The gentlewoman yields back.
Yes.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate the gentlelady's comments and her amendment. We don't intend to oppose her amendment, but I do want to pick up on something she said that's really important. You mentioned opioids, and in the last Congress, when I chaired the Energy and Commerce Committee, I helped lead the bipartisan effort that produced 60 pieces of legislation dealing with the opioid crisis to help those who are addicted get the assistance they need and resources into our communities, to help medical advancements to find non-opioid related medical treatments, to stop fentanyl from coming into our country. And I didn't get the opportunity, but I hope the President and his team will continue to raise this issue with the Chinese leadership when they come, because a lot of this illicit fentanyl is being produced in China and then coming to the United States. Dr. Burgess, that was our chair of the subcommittee on health and is now the top Republican, actually I think went up to the chairman's district in New Jersey and viewed one of the international mail processing facilities, or at least it was in New Jersey. I don't know its precise location. And together we said, working with the Trump administration's FDA director, we got to do more at these mail processing facilities to stop fentanyl from coming in. By the way, fentanyl is like 100 times more potent than morphine. If you had a salt shaker and put out, I don't know, 10, 15 grains of salt and ingested that, and it were fentanyl, it would kill you. And so we said, let's put more resources towards stopping illegal fentanyl from coming into the United States. And we're doing that now. We're beefing that up. And it comes in through Mexico as well. It's both China and Mexico. It is creating pockets of death in our communities, especially in some of our urban areas. We've seen where it gets mixed in with heroin to give you even a higher high or whatever. And then you see groups of people that take this not knowing it's been jacked up with fentanyl, and you have a whole group that die. Most insidious discussion or incident I heard about was a parent who I got to know a little bit, whose daughter, he told me, self-medicated occasionally with heroin. And she died in college. And when they did the autopsy, they figured out she'd been given 100% fentanyl. It wasn't a mix with heroin, Mr. Chairman. And the tragedy of that was he felt that her supplier knew she was an occasional user, so had low tolerance, and basically probably killed her to prove to his other buyers that he had the most potent stuff on the street. And a colleague of ours, Mr. Katko, who was a prosecutor before he came to the Congress, he and I were having a discussion on this matter, and he said he actually prosecuted a case just like that. That's how evil this stuff is. And so as we look at the whole panoply of issues about healthcare, about mental health services, addiction services, stopping these things from coming in, we can find a lot of common ground. The Republicans supported protections for pre-existing conditions before the ACA, during the ACA, after the ACA, today. We did. Same with putting kids on your policies at 26. We agreed with those principles. But as you know, the Obamacare Act was crammed through this House and the Senate, and we weren't even allowed to bring any of the 90-some amendments we offered to the floor. We were completely shut out of that process. It's a horrible process, and it shouldn't be repeated. And I hear a lot about how we voted to repeal it a bazillion times. Well, you know, if you go through and dissect those votes, there were a whole bunch of Democrats voted with us, and the president at the time, President Obama, signed some of that legislation because even he admitted there were problems in the ACA. And so going forward, I hope we can address the big problem in America, which is high cost insurance, high deductibles, but moreover, the high cost of health care itself. Because it's pretty hard to go home and explain why things cost what they do today. And so we've got to get around the high cost issue, the access issue, and that's where earlier I talked about telehealth and telemedicine. And so there's a lot of work we'll do together. Unfortunately, this is a mislabeled bill today, 1332 laws. The laws governing 1332 waivers prohibit what the majority is concerned about. But I don't have opposition to this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in Part A of the House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 4, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Harder of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from California, Mr. Harder, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of my amendment. As I stated in my previous remarks, my amendment would simply require the federal government to issue an expert analysis of the impact of junk plans on mental health access. People deserve access to mental health care, and we need to know how many people will lose that access if these junk plans become used more widely. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seek time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment, and
the gentleman is recognized.
And I'll reserve the balance of my time for the moment.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back. I'm prepared to close my remarks.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the gentleman's amendment. And look, we all care deeply about getting mental health services into our community. And in fact, under Republican leadership on the Energy and Commerce Committee a few years ago, we rewrote America's mental health laws for the first time since John Kennedy signed the last bill into law before he was tragically assassinated in Texas. And it was a lot of work, and it was bipartisan work. And not only did we look at those mental health laws that were on the books, because what happens around here is somebody comes up with a new idea, you put a new program in place, you give an authorization, maybe it gets funded, maybe it doesn't. Year goes by, somebody has a new idea, put another one on the books. Nobody ever goes back and looks what worked and what didn't. And so our colleague, Dr. Murphy, at the time, who was a mental health a psychologist and a terrific leader in this area and really drove this review, said, look, we got to help kids with mental illness. We need to help adults. we could, deal with a lot of the violence in America if you got people care. It's not that everybody with mental illness certainly goes violent, but we do know that mental health services help people in every way. And that the programs we had a lot of them, either weren't funded properly, or didn't work. Some worked better than others. And so we had this comprehensive review in the Energy and Commerce Committee of these different programs the federal government has. And then we said, going forward, let's measure kind of what you're trying to do with this GAO report in a little different way, but measure the efficacy of the programs we do have. Let's find out what's working in our communities, and then let's get aid into our communities directly. Cut out the middle bureaucracy and get assistance, financial assistance, into our communities. And so we passed that. That's now the law of the land. And I think last year we were able to get money into that, finally. And I hope we can do more going forward, because we know that, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but it's an extraordinary finding. Guess what? Your brain and your physical body are connected. Who knew, right? And we've all known that. And so I supported the effort to get the same treatment under insurance for mental health as physical health, because they are completely connected. And so going forward, we got to make sure that that bond is strengthened, not weakened, and that people continue to get help for mental health. And I'm a big believer in that. I know it works. And it's fascinating to see with the whole genome project now. They can do a genetic test and figure out which mental health drug will work in your body or my body. And we didn't know that before. Now they can figure out which one will actually work for you or me or whomever. And I hope we've lifted the stigma on people needing mental health services. We're just a big bag of chemicals and things get out of balance. And so I hope that we've lifted that, as we did, I believe, on addiction. There are a lot of people, and over time, people evolve their views and get better understandings. And I think over time, we realize that people with drug addictions, especially this came out through our opioids work, they weren't necessarily criminals. They weren't to be shunned from society, because what we learned in the course of our work on opioids was, I talked to parents whose kids were a high school football injury or something. A doc gives them a painkiller, and all of a sudden, this stuff is so addictive, a few treatments, and they're hooked, and then they need more and more and more and more. I always remember my friend, Mr. Rush from Chicago area, when we were talking about treatment for opioids, said, "That's great, you're doing that." And the people I represented had issues in terms of crack cocaine and all. You just called them druggies and you put them in prison. And that affected what we wrote and how we legislated. And we moved away from calling it treatment for opioids to people with substance abuse, because we realized we needed to think broader as a country and as a Congress. And we did that. We changed the law. And all that now is law to deal with opioids and mental health services. And so, Mr. Chairman, I don't have objection to this amendment. But there's a lot we have done and a lot more we need to do. And I'll talk about some of the things we need to do going forward, but I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk. I believe it's number 5, printed in House Report 116-51.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 5, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Walden of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Walden, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would just say that on terms of this amendment, it's just trying to make the point that what the bill we have before us today is not as described or labeled, in our opinion. It's more about politics and gotcha politics than it is about the underlying issue. We know from the Department of Health and Human Services, they've made it clear in the letter from the director who would approve these waivers that she believes that the underlying law protects people with pre-existing conditions and all the other things I talked about earlier, from that they can't waive that law. They cannot. And so I would enter into the record again, Mr. Chairman, as part of my remarks, her comments about the guidance, the 2018 guidance, and where she says it does not erode Obamacare's pre-existing condition provisions. She's the one in charge of this. That's what she's saying. But I want to talk about something else she says in this letter about premiums and the costs to people getting their insurance. She says under PPACA or Obamacare or the American Affordable Care Act, however you want to describe it, we have seen dramatically higher premiums and decreased options for millions of consumers, in large part due to the law's overly prescriptive mandates, excessive federal government takeover of areas traditionally left under state oversight. She points out in 2019, the average monthly premium for a benchmark plan for a family of four on healthcare.gov is now over $1,500, which can easily exceed a family's mortgage. Continuing with her letter to me, she said there are many areas of the country with far higher monthly premiums. For example, a 60-year-old couple living in Grand Island, Nebraska, making $60,000 a year, will need to pay over $3,000 a month for the lowest cost silver plan available. That's almost $38,000 a year for a plan with an $11,100 deductible. Now, think about that, Mr. Chair. This is a couple that is making $70,000 a year. They're 60 years old. They live in Nebraska. $3,000 a month in premium, and over $3,000, and $11,000 deductible. That's over $48,000, and they only make $70 a year. This is happening in America today. Heck, it's happening in Nebraska right now. And so what we're saying is people are walking away. She goes on to say, for millions of Americans, coverage this expensive is not a realistic option. Many choose to go without coverage. In fact, after average premiums rose by 21%, 1.3 million unsubsidized people walked away from the market in 2017. Those are the people we need to be helping. There's a lot more we need to be doing. I'll put the rest of this in the record, but I think everybody knows we're just trying to make a point with this amendment, and I'd ask unanimous consent to withdraw it.
Is there objection?
Yes.
Objection is heard. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I would ask to claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman will suspend. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, just to clarify from a parliamentary standpoint, am I being recognized on the objection to my unanimous I was just going to withdraw the amendment, but if he wants to speak on it, or we could do it after he speaks, or whatever you want to do. Okay, I'll reserve, Mr. Chairman, at this time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask to claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, it disturbs me, I guess, that my colleague on the other side, who I greatly respect, keeps mentioning this letter from Seema Verma, the CMS administrator. Nothing that she says in her letter is in any way going to change the guidance that she and the Trump administration have put forward that would undermine people with pre-existing conditions' ability to get good insurance if this guidance is allowed to continue and states get waivers pursuant to the guidance. Because again, the issue of affordability. You see, the problem is that the 1332 waivers, the way they're set out in the ACA, have certain guardrails, if you will, to prevent waivers that would allow for junk insurance and other policies that would undermine people with pre-existing conditions from getting good insurance. And those guardrails say that any kind of waiver has to guarantee affordability, has to guarantee comprehensive coverage the essential benefits package, robust coverage, and also not reduce the number of people that are insured. And this guidance that Seema Verma and the Trump administration have put forward does exactly the opposite, because it allows insurance to be sold if a state seeks to do so. That would eliminate, for example, hospitalization, or eliminate mental health coverage, or eliminate coverage for maternity care. Now, if you're someone with pre-existing conditions and they eliminate coverage for your pre-existing condition that relates to your pre-existing condition, you might as well not even have insurance. And that's why we say it's junk. And it lets a waiver be granted that would allow the states to, or an insurance company that states to charge more based on age, based on sex. I mean, the list goes on. So Seema Verma can send out all the letters she wants, but it doesn't mean anything. And, I'd like to say, one of the things that disturbs me most also is we on the Democratic side, myself and some of the other chairmen of some of the other committees, we sent a letter and a request because it's been pointed out repeatedly that Seema Verma has been putting out contracts up to $4 million a year to basically promote herself. And that is being investigated right now as we speak. So again, I don't like to, say bad things about people, but the bottom line is she's in no position to be telling us what's in this guidance. This guidance is going to hurt people with pre-existing conditions, and there's no way that she's going to get around it. I would reserve myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just suggest that it was Seema Verma, who's the head of CMS, that issued the guidance. So I think she is in a position to have a say about what she believes the guidance allows or doesn't. And to be clear, to quote her letter again, the 2018 guidance does nothing to erode PPACA's pre-existing condition provisions. That's what she's saying. And so I think that letter is important. She put it in writing. She has said that repeatedly. And so I take her at her word. I do. Now, Mr. Chairman, I was willing to withdraw the amendment, but that takes unanimous consent, and I just would attempt to do that again. I don't know if my colleague cares about that or not.
No objection.
Then, Mr. Chairman, so we can move on to the other amendments, I would ask unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. The gentleman yields. The chair understands that amendment number 6 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider amendment number 7, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
In Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Holding of North Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holdings, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, I believe my amendment speaks for itself. My friends on the other side of the aisle are playing political games with their bill, trying to convince the American people that it would accomplish something that it would not. And I have offered a title that accurately reflects the political grandstanding of my Democrat friends are affecting today. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to claim the time in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
And I rise in opposition to the amendment, Mr. Chairman. Just to back up what I said previously about the implications for this Trump administration and Seema Verma's guidance that they've put forward with regard to 1332, I wanted to read a section from a letter that was sent by 23 patient and consumer advocacy organizations in support of H.R. 986, the bill that's before us. And these organizations, include the Heart Association, the Lung Association, the Epilepsy Foundation, et cetera. And they state and this goes back to the guardrails. As I said, under 1332 in the ACA, there are guardrails that say that any waivers have to guarantee affordability, have to guarantee comprehensiveness of coverage, and have to at the same time not reduce the number of people with insurance. And nothing that Seema Verma or anything that's being said on the other side is suggesting in any way that under this guidance that those principles wouldn't be violated. In fact, they would be violated. So this is what these 23 patient and consumer advocacy organizations say about the Trump guidance waiver. And I quote, "This gross misinterpretation of the guardrails will have real consequences for patients, steering people into substandard coverage such as short-term, limited duration plans and association health plans, which often do not cover the full range of benefits and services that patients rely on to manage their conditions. Further, policies that could be implemented under this new interpretation could fundamentally alter the risk pool for a state's individual marketplace, making comprehensive coverage unaffordable for patients who rely on it, and jeopardizing the stability of the state's marketplace. The resulting lack of access to care could have devastating short and long-term consequences for the millions of patients we represent." So the bottom line is this is going to dramatically hurt people with pre-existing conditions if they try to buy insurance that will cover the maladies that they want to cover and they need to have covered. So, you know, again, I don't understand, Mr. Holding and previously Mr. Walden have these amendments that really have nothing substantive to say. All they do is talk about changing the title because they're trying to ridicule what Democrats are trying to do here, which is to guarantee that people with pre-existing conditions are protected. And, you know, I don't want to get upset, but I think that it's kind of inappropriate when here we are trying to guarantee people with pre-existing conditions that they're protected. Even the Republicans on the other side are saying that's important to them. And instead of having a serious debate about this, they put forward amendments that change the title to ridicule what we're trying to do. It's just unfortunate that we're at that point now, but that's where we are. So with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I will yield to the gentleman for Oregon.
I thank the gentleman. And I just want to say, I too wish we were debating my legislation that I tried to offer the first to the Congress, was refused the opportunity to bring it to the floor. That would lock into statute pre-existing protections for people who have pre-existing conditions. This court case is pending. We can get a ruling tomorrow. Somewhere in the last couple of months, Congress could have acted to put in statute a separate law that would be there irrespective of the decision of the judge or judges as it goes through its process, that could wipe out all of the ACA, could wipe out pre-existing protections, pre-existing condition protections. So we could do that, except your Committee on Rules put these amendments in order to debate on the floor, but not the amendment that actually protect people with pre-existing conditions. So it's not my fault. We don't control the Rules Committee. That my serious amendment about protecting people with pre-existing conditions was not made in order. I don't control the Rules Committee. Speaker does, and others. And when you talk about affordability, remember the example that Seema Verma points out, like Grand Island, Nebraska, a couple making $60,000 a year, 60 years old, $38,000 for the plan and $11,000 deductible. How's that affordable? It's not. I want our states to innovate. And you know what? If a state doesn't want to innovate, it doesn't have to. And if they violate the rules, they're not going to get their waiver. But what we do know is when states have innovated, like mine, like yours, Wisconsin, Alaska, they've seen reductions in premiums and full-throated coverage. I want innovation. I don't want to price people out of the market. I yield back.
The gentleman from North Carolina.
This bill, Madam Chairman, before us today makes no structural changes to improve access to or delivery of care. It would limit healthcare choices, stifle state-level innovation that has proven to lower premiums. This bill does not help those with pre-existing conditions, but it does attempt to confuse them and encourage more political dysfunction to the detriment of the American people. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, my colleagues on the other side started out this debate on these amendments by, basically saying they want to substitute the title rather than talking about the substance. Now, my colleague, the ranking member, starts talking about the lawsuit that would, I think, he's talking about the lawsuit that would repeal the Affordable Care Act. Again, my colleagues on the other side are not looking to protect people with pre-existing conditions. They're not looking to protect anybody because now they're saying that it's a good idea to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So we're back to the basic debate about whether or not we should have the Affordable Care Act, which until President Trump came along and started sabotaging the bill, it was up to covering 95% of Americans had health insurance, an all-time high in the history of this country. So, okay, that's fine. Now we're going to say that you want to repeal the Affordable Care Act once again. This is what this is all about on their side of the aisle. Repeal the act, move to court to try to get the courts to declare the act unconstitutional. No effort to worry about the millions and millions of Americans who've gotten coverage because of the Affordable Care Act. So I really don't know what else I can say at this point, but at least they revealed their true motive, which is to simply repeal the whole bill. Once again, I guess there's not much to say here other than to say that I would urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. And let's get back to talking about the substance of the bill that's before us, which would guarantee that there are protections for people with pre-existing conditions. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair.
Madam Speaker, I would ask, Madam Chair, I would ask for a recorded vote.
Yeah, but what is the? In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from New Jersey requests a recorded vote. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in Part A of House Report 11651. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Porter of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Porter, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
I rise today to offer an amendment to the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act. This bill would prevent the Trump administration from allowing states to use waivers to provide junk health plans that reduce coverage and decrease cost-sharing provisions. In the Affordable Care Act, Section 1332 waivers were created to provide states flexibility to implement innovative plans that would expand coverage, reduce costs, and provide more comprehensive benefits. Our states can be incubators for opportunity, and these waivers allow them the opportunity to improve access to affordable, quality services in groundbreaking ways. But last year, the Trump administration released guidance that would allow states to use these waivers to take care away from the individuals who need it most, and that is unacceptable. Because of the Affordable Care Act, 3,826,000 Californians have gained health coverage. And in my home district, the 45th District of California, more than 338,000 people have a pre-existing condition, many of whom gain coverage or receive more affordable coverage because of new protections established under the Affordable Care Act. This Sunday is Mother's Day. Having given birth, being a mother, is a pre-existing condition, a factor that used to contribute to higher insurance costs for most of the women we will celebrate this weekend. We can't go back to the days when being a woman was enough to let an insurance company charge you more for basic health care. My amendment will prohibit the administration from issuing any waivers that would let states craft healthcare plans that would reduce the number of individuals enrolled in comprehensive plans that are compliant with our country's current healthcare laws. This bill preserves waivers that provide states with flexibility. This bill encourages states to provide innovative plans. But what this bill does is just make sure that those waivers can be used for their original intent, expanding care and decreasing costs. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek time in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to point out a couple of things. One, I've introduced legislation to protect people with pre-existing conditions. I did that because I knew this lawsuit is pending. And we can argue about the ACA and the lawsuit and all that, but the long and the short of it is the court rules and the ACA gets thrown out as unconstitutional, which may happen. People with pre-existing conditions would be exposed. And I don't want that to happen. That's why I introduced legislation. And I'd be honored if we could take that up in the Energy and Commerce Committee that I used to chair and put it on the House floor. I tried to bring it here as an amendment and was denied by the Democrat majority. So we can't even have the debate here about it. And if it's not everything it should be, then I'm happy to work with people to try and make it as durable and robust as it needs to be. So that's one. When we talk about insurance, it's kind of silence on the other side that 2.5 million Americans since President Trump have gotten health care insurance through their employer. Because we have one of the most robust economies most Americans have ever seen. 3.2%, I think, GDP growth in the first quarter. Or some have said, oh, you'd need fairy dust to do that. Well, that's not true. You need good economic policy. We have that in America. Lowest unemployment for African Americans, Hispanic Americans, all Americans. Incredible numbers, incredible growth. And as a result, people are getting off the government subsidized health care or fully funded health care onto private health insurance, which Democrats want to wipe out. 158 million Americans get their health insurance through their employer or through their union. And when it comes to the Affordable Care Act, that's what put in place the big cuts that are coming to our hospitals, the DSH cuts that I held off as chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. We passed legislation to prevent the DSH cuts from hitting our disproportionate share hospitals, those that deal with more lower income folks. We're gonna have to do that again because Obamacare says you gotta hit your hospital with a big cost increase, if you will, or take away a subsidy. Cadillac tax. I've met with the building trades folks in my state. These people bargained away potentially wages for better benefits. And then along comes Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, quote unquote, that says, oh, by the way, if you got too generous a plan, according to the government, you're going to have to pay a 40% tax on that plan. And by the way, it was never indexed for inflation. And guess what? Healthcare costs continue to go up. Premiums go up. More and more Americans' health insurance is going to fall into this so-called Cadillac tax. There'll be a 40% tax on those plans that working men and women who are part of a union or in private sector. They have good, generous health care benefits. And the federal government, the Democrat-driven plan that was totally partisan passed, it says we're going to whack you with a 40% tax. How fair is that, Madam Chair? How fair is that? I don't think it is. We've kept that tax from taking effect as Republicans. We'll see what this Congress does. But moreover, we fully funded our community health centers. We, under Republicans, funded the Children's Health Insurance Program, a Republican creation, for a decade. I led that effort. Most Democrats consistently voted against funding children's health insurance, time and time again. It had never been funded for more than 5 years, ever in its history. 122,700 Oregonian kids and pregnant moms get their health insurance through CHIP. It's a marvelous program. Republicans led the effort because I did it. We first tried to get it 5, then 6, and then eventually we got 10 years funded. That's locked into law. Locked into law. We need to go back and fund our community health centers. I've told people, if I were chairman, my palms be getting a little sweaty now at the list of things we need to get done. I'm looking at my friends. In Oregon, my district, I think we got 63 delivery sites, 12 community health centers. We fully funded those centers at a record level in the last Congress because I believe fully in that network of delivery of health care. It's extraordinarily important. And so we should be doing that today, but we're not. We've got National Health Service Corps, special diabetes programs for Indians, special diabetes programs for type 1 diabetes, teaching health centers, personal responsibility education programs, sexual risk avoidance education grants, family-to-family health information centers. We have demo programs to increase access to dental health care services, delay and authority to terminate contracts for Medicare Advantage plans. We have protection for recipients of HCBS against spousal impoverishment. We have demonstration to improve community behavioral health clinics, Medicaid funding for territories, delay an effective date for Medicaid amendments, related to beneficiary liability settlements, dish allotment, and money follows the person. All those expire at the end of this fiscal year. We have real work we need to get done, Madam
The gentleman's
Chair.
time has expired.
I yield back.
The gentlewoman from California.
I yield 1 minute to the distinguished speaker.
The speaker is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I thank her for a very constructive amendment and for her leadership as a leading member of an outstanding freshman class. Thank you, Congresswoman Porter, for your exceptional leadership. And you, Mr. Pallone, Chairman of the full committee, thank you for giving us the opportunity to bring to the floor historic legislation that will make a tremendous difference in the lives of the American people. Today, with the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act, Democrats are honoring their promises for the American people. As you know, Mr. Chairman and Congresswoman Porter, our Democratic majority ran on the promise to protect America's families' quality, affordable health care. We have now voted 3 times to oppose GOP health care lawsuit, but every time, with every vote, House Republicans reveal their inconsistency and complicity in the administration's assault on people with pre-existing conditions and every American's health care. It was interesting to listen to the distinguished ranking member of the committee express his views the fact is that 2 years ago, House Republicans voted to gut protections for people with pre-existing conditions and take away millions of families' health care, and then threw a party to celebrate. They went down to the White House and celebrated. We have taken away the pre-existing condition benefit. The American people resoundingly rejected the Republicans' attack on their health care and the financial security. And yet the GOP is plowing full steam ahead with their monstrous campaign to sabotage the Affordable Care Act and take away health care. Just last week, the administration doubled down on its demands that the courts throw out every protection and benefit provided by the Affordable Care Act. And again, over and over, we have had bills on the floor to invite the Republicans to join us in rejecting that Republican attack. And overwhelmingly, they have rejected that. So today, again, we can celebrate that we are protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions and honoring that promise we made to the American people, as I said. The bill reverses a dangerous part of the Trump administration's reckless sabotage campaign, blocking cynical guidance that invites states. Here's what they do. Dismantle protections for people with pre-existing conditions and push families into junk plans that discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions and do not cover essential benefits. In fact, you're paying for nothing. The Trump guidance puts lives on the line, not only sabotaging the health care law, but the health of millions of Americans who rely on it. Nearly 30 national groups representing people with pre-existing conditions have spoken out, including the American Cancer Society, Cancer Action Network, the American Heart Association, American Diabetes Association, American Lung Association, National Alliance on Mental Health, Susan G. Komen, and many more. They write, This dangerous action could take us back to the days when people with pre-existing conditions were openly discriminated against and blatantly denied access to life-saving care. These organizations, Ranking Member Walden, they said, just wanted you to hear, because you seem to have been distracted, all of these organizations, cancer, diabetes, heart, lung, mental health, all of that, they write of what you're doing. This dangerous action could take us back to the days when people with pre-existing conditions were openly discriminated against and blatantly denied access to life-saving care. We thank all the groups and families, including the sick little children, the little lobbyists, for their courage to speak out and show that this is a fight not just about legislation, about lives. Nothing is more eloquent than the stories that they tell, and many have told their stories here. They had 10,000 events around the country to stop the Republican sabotage on health care, much of it from people with pre-existing conditions, especially children born with a pre-existing condition. This bill that we have today is just the beginning. In the coming weeks, House Democrats will bring forward more bold legislation to reduce the price of prescription drugs, to empower states to build better exchanges, and to block junk plans and reverse the GOP's enrollment sabotage. Senator McConnell says that he is the Grim Reaper. He wears that as a badge of honor. He's the Grim Reaper. He's going to kill any House legislation for the people, saying that he will bury our bills in a Senate graveyard effectively. That's really not a very hopeful political agenda, the Grim Reaper. But I have news for him. Legislation to protect the pre-existing condition benefit and many of the other pieces of this agenda are alive and well among the American people, and they will make their voices heard. The American people want action, and the special interest GOP Senate needs to stop standing in their way, Leader McConnell. I urge a strong vote for this legislation for the people. Commend the gentlelady for her very important amendment about, she said, being a mom with a pre-existing condition as the mother of 5 in 6 years to the day. When I talked to the insurance company about my bad back, they said, why would we even insure you? You are a poor risk having had children. I said, that's funny you say that. I thought it was a show of strength on my part to have 5 children. And you're calling that something that would be a barrier to my getting insurance. So I want to emphasize, as we approach Mother's Day, how important this particular amendment to help moms and their families is. So I urge a yes vote on Congresswoman Porter's important Mother's Day amendment. And yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
I yield back.
The question on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Hampshire seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 9, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Pappas of New Hampshire.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from New Hampshire, Mr. Pappas, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I want to thank my colleague from New Hampshire, Representative Custer, for offering this legislation, which will safeguard healthcare protections for the 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions. The amendment I'm offering today would ensure we don't take any steps backward in our fight against this nation's opioid epidemic. For people in my home state of New Hampshire, the Affordable Care Act is a life-saving law, and it's the best tool we have to combat the opioid crisis. As I travel around my district, I hear heartbreaking stories of those lost and those still fighting hard. I also hear from constituents who on a regular basis can't fathom where they'd be without coverage for their substance use disorder. I'm here today on behalf of constituents like Phil Spaniolo from Laconia As Phil fought to recover from substance use disorder, he took comfort in knowing that he could rely on coverage that was affordable and accessible to him in the midst of the greatest medical challenge of his life. Thanks to the Affordable Care Act, Phil has gone from jail to treatment and recovery, to serving as a leader in the recovery community, coaching and advocating for those grappling with addiction. New Hampshire is incredibly proud of his story and his example, and it's made all possible because of the ACA and its basic protections. The collective impact of substance use disorder coverage has expanded treatment and recovery opportunities in New Hampshire and across this country. Unfortunately, far too many still do not access this kind of life-saving care. We still lose 130 Americans each and every day in their battle with opioid addiction. The scope of this crisis is simply immense. No region, no community, no family has been spared. Despite the alarming statistics, the administration issued guidance that would allow insurance companies to discriminate against Americans with pre-existing conditions, including the 19.7 million Americans like Phil with a history of substance use. That's why I'm offering this amendment today, to strengthen the underlying legislation and prohibit any further actions to reduce the availability or affordability of coverage for those battling substance use disorder. We should be working together to open the doors to those most in need, not shutting them because of politics. I urge the adoption of this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Hampshire.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm willing to close if the gentleman from Oregon is, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Oregon.
Actually, I believe I get to close, don't I?
The gentleman from Oregon has the right to close.
That was what I thought, so I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a critical issue. This is an important piece of legislation, and I, for one, don't trust this administration to get it right. They've tried every trick they can in the book to repeal the Affordable Care Act outright legislatively, to undermine it administratively, and they've gone to the courts to take away critical protections from Americans who need them most. And I, for one, am not going to stand for it. The people of New Hampshire and of this country are ensuring that we get this right for them. And it's very critical that we ensure that for those suffering from substance use disorder, that those important protections remain on the books so that people can access care. There's no more important tool in our toolbox than ensuring that people have health insurance to take care of their substance use disorder. And that's why I brought forward this amendment today. So thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Section 1332 already requires that the state plan will provide coverage that is at least as comprehensive as the essential health benefits, including mental health and substance use disorder services. That's already required, including behavioral health treatment, and will provide coverage to at least a comparable number of its residents. That's already in the 1332 requirements. And I appreciate the gentleman's passion for dealing with the opioid epidemic. I led the effort that brought together Republicans and Democrats. We passed 60 different pieces of legislation. I think 57 of them, by the time we were done working together, passed unanimously in this House. We bundled them up into H.R. 6 because we all know the Senate can't handle 57 or 60 different pieces of legislation, but they could handle one. And the work we did here and the work they did there ended up in, I would argue, the nation's most comprehensive legislation to address a drug problem our country's ever faced. And that's now law. And the President of the United States, that was just disparaged here on the House floor, helped lead this effort because he passionately cares about the issue of addiction. He lost a brother, I believe, to alcoholism. And he was a leader, and his team were leaders in this effort we put together on opioids. And he invited Republicans and Democrats to the White House for the bill signing, and Mrs. Trump helped organize all of that. And this legislation is comprehensive on opioids. It wasn't part of the ACA. You see, we can work together and improve underlying laws, and we can address major problems facing the country when majorities want to do that. And we did it last Congress under my leadership. And it was Republicans and Democrats. And we didn't start out agreeing on some of these matters, but we ended up there with just a couple of exceptions. And you can, I sent my friend, Madam Chair, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee today, a comprehensive list of kind of what we learned in the final phase of our investigation into how America ended up in the place it was with opioids. And there are some additional recommendations I hope and I assume we'll get to out of that investigative report that we concluded at the end of the year. So hopefully we'll get there. I believe we need to do oversight on the legislation we pass. I've always felt that about bills we pass. We need to go take a second look. What's working? What's not? We're not going to get it right the first time. And we always know there's more to do, and we need to do that on what was H.R. 6 in the last Congress, our opioids legislation. I'm not opposed to the gentleman's amendment. You have to say you are to get the time, I guess, but I'm not. And I fully am committed to making sure that people with substance abuse disorder continue to get the help they need in our communities. That's what our whole legislative thrust was about last Congress, will remain there. As I say, Section 1332 already requires that in these plans. And again, remember what we're talking about here is states coming to the federal government saying, we have a better idea to fill a gap so there are people who have affordable insurance. And that's what a waiver is under 1332. And I guess I have more confidence in my state than others must have in theirs. But I think from my own experience, Republicans, Democrats work together in Oregon to get health insurance out and coverage out and expand access to care. And I've always continued to try to do that. And I have faith my state would do this. And by the way, these plans, and we'll hear more about them next week, but they're regulated by state insurance commissioners. I mean, so I'm not in the school that says all those people are bad and we're the only ones with a great idea. So I want innovation. I want it from the states. I want to drive down costs of health care while improving access and delivery to services. And so I'm not opposed to the gentleman's amendment. I do hope we can address these issues of fully funding our community health centers, our National Health Service Corps, and these diabetes programs, which we reauthorized and funded in the last Congress, we need to do again. They're called the Special Diabetes Program for Indians and Special Diabetes Program for Type 1 Diabetes. We've got to get after that too, Madam Chair, and you have to find the money to do it. It's not easy. I know we have a lot of other things. I just wish we were doing those sorts of things today, because these expire in September, and we don't have that many legislative days left. And so hopefully we can move on to the things I know we could agree on and find solutions for, and that we do it sooner rather than later. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Hampshire. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 10, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 10, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Ruda of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruda, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 9 years ago, our nation took a monumental step forward to address the needs of millions of Americans with a pre-existing condition. Before the passage of the Affordable Care Act, individuals across the country were denied coverage or charged higher premiums due to their medical history. While I came to Washington to protect our health care, the Trump administration has continued its assault on the Affordable Care Act. In this case, the administration is trying to use an ACA provision designed to give states the ability to test new health insurance reforms that could improve the well-being of their residents. But instead, that provision is being used to undermine protections for people with pre-existing conditions and the coverage of essential health benefits, all in an effort to prop up junk short-term insurance plans. Today, we will stand up to that assault on America's health care by passing H.R. 986 to nullify these efforts. We must be clear that any future administrative actions by this administration or any other administration should not harm the vulnerable populations that the Affordable Care Act was designed to protect. To that end, my amendment would prohibit any future rule or guidance from diminishing the Affordable Care Act that would result in a reduction in the availability, affordability, and comprehensiveness for people with pre-existing conditions, the elderly, and low-income individuals. My amendment would affirm these critical guardrails that protect the care of so many Americans across our country and help strengthen and uphold the principles of this landmark law. I would like to thank Chairman Pallone, Chairman Neal, and the respective staff for their assistance with this amendment. I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this amendment to ensure that this and future administrations do not undermine the health care of vulnerable populations. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek time in opposition to the at least as comprehensive as the essential health benefits, including mental health and substance use disorder services, including behavioral health treatment, and will provide coverage to at least a comparable number of its residents. With that, Madam Chair, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California.
Thank you. I reclaim the balance of my time. We're at a crossroads in our country. When we look at the global stage, there are approximately 200 countries, of which 40 are industrialized developed countries. Of those 40 industrialized developed countries, 39 of them have universal health care. Only one does not. The wealthiest, greatest country in the history of the world. That's why we have tens of millions of individuals in our country without insurance. And we know that pre-existing conditions has to be covered, because when we look at the fact that this country spends 18.5% of its GDP on healthcare, almost double what these other industrialized developed countries spend, you would think the United States of America has the healthiest people in the world. Madam Chair, that is not the case. It is sad to report that most critical criteria when looking at Americans' healthcare, we are in the bottom quartile, even though we spend 18.5% of our GDP. We know that the inability to pay healthcare costs is a leading cause of involuntary bankruptcy and homelessness. Pre-existing conditions is the underlying reason for those two things. That's why we must make sure that we protect affordable healthcare in the United States through the Act, and making sure that pre-existing conditions are covered today and tomorrow for future generations. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll continue to reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California.
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oregon.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume. And I just want to go back to what's going on in America's healthcare costs and look at some of what's going on elsewhere around the world. And first of all, I would draw the members' attention, Madam Chair, to the Kaiser Foundation report that Axios reported on about people who have health insurance and still can't afford to use it. And they talked about just over half of those employer coverage have some sort of chronic disease, so they have health insurance. But the deductibles at $3,000 are so high, 3 to 5, that 3/4 reported skipping or postponing some type of care. Half, 49%, said a family member had a problem paying medical bills or difficulty affording their premiums, deductibles, or copays in the last year. What we're trying to do is help those people in the individual market. We'd love to help these people in the market that employer-provided health insurance is in as well, and put downward pressure on pricing and go after the cost of health care. One end to the other. Now, the gentleman from California, I believe, has talked about going to I guess, government-run single-payer system. I've got 2 veterans that spend virtually full time helping veterans in Oregon's 2nd District get access to a similar sort of system. You'd know it as the VA. And you think about the problems we have with that government-run single sort of payer-operated system. If you get in, I've got veterans say it's great, I get coverage. But it's people have to wait 6 months to get eyeglasses at one point, or they can't get in to get their surgery done. And we've worked with thousands of veterans that have to come to their member of Congress to be able to get access to the health care they were promised when they put on the nation's uniform. We have that system in place, and it has incredible problems in wait times. So I had to create the choice program and everything else. And then I was intrigued by a story about a woman in Nova Scotia, 33 years old. She's under one of those systems my friend wants for us, I guess. 3 trips to the emergency room, they just never would believe her and her problem and see her, and she couldn't get access to doctors. And when she finally did, her anal cancer had progressed to stage 3. And now at 33, she's in menopause, she writes. She had a Facebook post recently wanting to meet with the premier to explain how broken their healthcare system is. We all know stories about Canadians come across the border who can afford to get their healthcare done here because they can get it done sooner. We all know stories in other countries where they have global budgets, and when they run out, you're done. I mean, I've had people tell me, the little secret is get sick before June because they're going to run out and you won't get in. And that's what's going on around the world. And I think in many measures, when people are especially sick, if they have the money, they come to the United States for care. They go to MD Anderson, they go to the Mayo Clinic. Those are the folks that come to America. What I want is the MD Andersons, the Mayo Clinics, and the Oregon Health Sciences University and these other places to be affordable and available to all Americans. We had a hearing today, I think it's pretty good, on drug pricing. We had, following up on one I did 2 years ago, looking at, the manufacturers, the PBMs, the distributors, the insurers, every piece of this, everybody's getting a chunk. And the result is we have a healthcare system that costs too much. So let's go figure that out. And that's what innovation is about. And that's what our states can do. And they're wonderful laboratories. And some of them will do really good things. And some of them will make some mistakes and learn from it. And we should pick the best from among the states. And that's what we're looking for here in these 1332 waivers are some flexibility for our states to go innovate. And I believe our states, my colleagues, and by the way, Oregon's completely Democrat controlled, but they care about the citizens of the state of Oregon, and so is the insurance commissioner. And they're only going to ask for permission for a plan that will be better than what the federal government's trying to jam down their throat in a one-size-fits-all. So I don't object to the gentleman's amendment. I think we can do better by harnessing great innovation. We do it in medicine. We do it everywhere else. We have competitive insurance products for, a lot of other things we buy. And I'd like to see more options, more choice, more transparency in healthcare, and more consumer involvement. And so with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 11, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Malinowski of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Madam Chair, there are many problems in our healthcare system. We've heard about a number of them today, but we are here for one simple, specific reason: because of the guidance that the administration issued last year that allows states to expand the availability and duration of junk short-term insurance plans. Now, the administration and its defenders will not say this because it's become politically impossible to do so, but these plans are cheaper precisely because they deny coverage to people with pre-existing conditions and for what any reasonable person would agree are essential benefits like maternity care and prescription drugs. That's what they mean when they use the euphemism flexibility. Where these plans take hold, here's what happens in plain language. If you have a pre-existing condition, you have a choice. Either stay in your ACA plan and see your premiums rise as healthy people move to cheaper junk insurance, or you sign up for a junk plan yourself and risk getting gouged when the services you need aren't covered. You end up with a two-tier healthcare system in America, one for healthy people and one for sick people. Now, the underlying bill rescinds that guidance. The amendment I have submitted would prohibit the administration from taking any other action that would reduce the affordability of comprehensive coverage for Americans with pre-existing conditions. Now, this would not in any way prevent states from using Section 1332 waivers to make healthcare better and more affordable. Many states, as we've heard, have done so in ways that have lowered health insurance premiums without in any way undermining protections for people with pre-existing conditions. And yes, Section 1332 has a clear directive that states must maintain the benefits, affordability, and coverage provided by the ACA. But it's clear that the administration has disregarded these standards and could do so again to remove protections for vulnerable groups, to promote expansion of health plans that are not compliant with the ACA, and to take other steps that would increase costs, especially for women and older adults. This amendment, along with the overall bill, makes sure that we keep our promise to the American people. It makes clear that when we say we are going to protect everyone with a pre-existing condition, that is not an empty slogan that means whatever we want it to mean. Those words mean something, that every American deserves quality health insurance. No American should be forced to pay more for good coverage because of a pre-existing health problem. That's what H.R. 986 and my amendment guarantee, and I urge my colleagues to support both. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek recognition in opposition to the gentleman's amendment.
Yeah, the gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I'll just close by saying that there's no question whatsoever what the administration intends to do. They have been trying from day one, from January of 2017, to repeal the Affordable Care Act and its essential protections for the American people. The only thing that's changed is that it's become politically impossible for anyone in America to say that you are opposed to protecting people with pre-existing conditions. And so a war against healthcare protections is being covered up by a war against the English language. Everyone says, we're for pre-existing conditions. And yet every single step the administration and its supporters take is designed to weaken those protections. This amendment and the underlying bill say you can't do that anymore. They guarantee going forward that the ACA's protections are respected and that any experimentation by the states will have to be consistent with those protections. So, with that, I urge my colleagues' support for the amendment and the bill. I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Yes, sir. The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd not oppose this amendment because this amendment doesn't do anything the law already, I think, requires. So Section 1332 does not permit states to waive pre-existing condition protections. Section 1332 already requires that the state plan will provide coverage that's at least as comprehensive as the essential health benefits and will provide coverage and cost-sharing protections against excessive out-of-pocket spending. That's what the underlying law already does. We have the assurance from the CMS administrator saying, once again, to be clear, 2018 guidance does nothing to erode the PPACA's pre-existing condition provisions, which cannot be waived under Section 1332. She's the one that makes the decision. By the way, I would just point out no state has come to the Trump administration under this new authority that we're aware of and said, please approve our plan. Junk plans. We'll hear more about that term of art. By the way, those junk plans were allowed for under the Obama administration and under the ACA. At that time, they were only allowed for 3 months. Seemed to be a lot of interest in a variety of options for citizens to take advantage of that covered their needs. And so the Trump administration said, well, if they're good for 3 months, what if we extend them to 12 months or just at 12 months? And that's what they did. And now they were junk plans under Trump. They were wonderful options under Obama. It's the same set of plans. And you can always go on the exchange. You can always find other coverage that fits your needs. We're trying to not have just one plan that nobody can afford. And that's what you're seeing in this situation that Ms. Verma, Seema Verma put forward, the head of the CMS, the administrator for Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And she uses as an example the situation in Grand Island, Nebraska. It's not Oregon, it's Nebraska. $70,000 a year, 60-year-old couple. They're paying $38,000 a year for their insurance with an $11,100 deductible. Now, how is that affordable? Anybody in here think that's a great idea? That's what you're saying. Don't innovate. We got it. We got it covered. ACA's got it covered. No need for innovation here. Nothing to see. Plan works great. And then we know from the Kaiser Foundation study, people are saying, I can't afford it. So I jack up my credit card. I wipe out my savings. All this is going on. The ACA did not solve every problem. It expanded coverage. You can't help but do that, spend that much money. And states like mine took full advantage of it. But we're left with these pockets and problems in America that I think states could assist us in if we gave them the authority, expanded authority under 1332 waivers to say, hey, guess what, Washington? We got a better idea here. Here it is. Take a look at it. Make sure it fits the federal guidelines and law, but let us innovate. And Oregon did that under the prior 1332 approval process. Insurance rates went down 6%. Wisconsin down 10.6. New Jersey 15. Maryland 43. Maine 9.4. Minnesota 20. Alaska 34.7. Using this sort of mother may I approval. That's what you have to do. I remember when Oregon did the Oregon Health Plan, and I was in the state legislature then, and we had to plead and beg with the administration at the time to get approval to try and experiment on Medicaid coverage, to expand coverage and improve access to care. Couldn't do it without Mother Washington, Father Washington, Brother Washington, whoever back here saying, yeah, okay, we'll let you try that. We should be in a partnerships with our states. And by the way, states can pass a law and say, we're not going down this path. They have every right to do it. I think New Jersey's done it. I think California's done it. None of these short-term duration plans, we're not going to be part of that. And every state has that right. But there are a lot of states that look at their citizens and say $38,000 a year for your insurance and $11,000 for your deductible, and you're making $70,000. You're 60 years old. That's not working real well either. So maybe we can find a product that would work for you and help you out. So we're talking about a range of options, choices. America has always done well, and markets do better when we have more choices. And that's what we're talking about here. So gentleman's amendment, I don't object to it all. I think it's the underlying law as described by the head of the department that would have to approve all these on the 1332 waivers. And so with that, Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 12, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 12, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Ms. Wild of Pennsylvania.
Pursuant to House Resolution 357, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to offer an amendment to H.R. 986, the Protecting Americans with Pre-Existing Conditions Act of 2019. My amendment would put an end to the rising cost of premiums. It's an amendment that should be met with overwhelming bipartisan support and without opposition. Specifically, my amendment would prohibit the administration from taking any further action that would result in higher premiums for Americans who need comprehensive coverage. This administration has unilaterally made healthcare more expensive and less accessible for the American people by taking actions that run contrary to the spirit and purpose of the ACA. That's resulted in higher premiums and reduced enrollment. In 2017, the administration stopped cost-sharing payments that helped reduce out-of-pocket costs for low-income Americans. This action alone increased premiums by 20% and raised costs for families not receiving subsidies. In 2018, the administration issued new Section 1332 guidance that allows states to raise healthcare costs for people with pre-existing conditions. This 2018 guidance also gave a green light to insurance companies to expand junk plans that don't cover essential health benefits. We know that pulling healthy people out of the pool only makes insurance premiums more expensive for those with pre-existing conditions. Also in 2018, the administration slashed funding for consumer enrollment assistance and outreach. The goal? Reduced healthcare enrollment. The result? Higher premiums. And just last month, the administration finalized a rule that would increase limits on total out-of-pocket costs for millions. The administration moved forward with this, even though the rule itself noted that all commenters on this topic expressed opposition to or concerns about the proposed change. And this past Monday, the administration released a notice seeking comment on a proposal that would reduce eligibility for Medicaid and cut premium tax credits for millions. It is time to say no to future attempts to sabotage working Americans' health care. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman for Oregon seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I seek recognition and claim time in opposition to the gentlelady's amendment.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
And I'll reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
Madam Speaker, my amendment is about fairness. Patients should not face increased premiums at the whim of appointed government officials, especially for essential health benefits like emergency services, maternity, newborn, pediatric care, mental health and substance abuse treatment, prescription drugs, laboratory services, preventive and wellness services for chronic disease management. From malicious lawsuits aimed at striking down the ACA in its entirety, and along with it, the protections for pre-existing conditions, to ending the practice of public advertisement of enrollment periods and educating the people about the complexities of health insurance, it has become clear that Congress must reclaim its legislative authority and ensure that this administration faithfully executes the spirit of this law. The ACA is the law. The Constitution gives Congress the power to make laws and requires the executive branch to faithfully execute the laws that Congress passes. We all heard Republicans on the campaign trail last year say that they would protect coverage for pre-existing conditions and help drive down premiums. This is their chance to fulfill those campaign promises with concrete action. Action, not words, is what the American people demand, and it's what they deserve. Let's make that commitment a reality by passing this amendment, passing this bill, and pushing the Senate to take it up so that we can get it signed into law. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
In closing, Madam Speaker, this is about standing up for the dignity of working families in the most basic and fundamental sense. It's about saying that every child, woman, man, and family in this country deserves the same certainty of being able to afford high-quality health care. Our people deserve better. We need to stop the political gamesmanship, and we need to focus on people across our country who need good, affordable health care right now. This is also our chance to remind this administration and future administrations that Congress makes the laws, and the executive branch doesn't get to fool around with the implementation just to see it fail for political reasons. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Does the gentlewoman yield?
I yield the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Oregon.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So let's talk about this a minute. I talked earlier about all the things that need to be reauthorized: community health centers, special diabetes programs, all of that, which I know the committee is aware of, and I hope we can begin marching through. I wish we were dealing with that today. I heard from the gentlelady about Republicans and pre-existing condition, and where's your plan? It's sitting up in the Rules Committee, because your party would not allow my amendment to do that, to be brought to the floor for debate today. I don't control the Rules Committee. It's 2-1 by the majority. It's just the way it works around here, and I respect that. but you'd allow my amendments that were more in jest about the false nature of the title of the bill to be debated, but not the substantive amendment I offered, which does protect people with pre-existing conditions in case the lawsuit were to prevail and Obamacare is thrown out. But no, we couldn't have that debate. I've asked for my bill to be considered in the community of jurisdiction. That hasn't happened either. I've also asked for the Democrats' one-size-fits-all takeover of health care, whatever the Medicare for all, however we want to describe it, we have a hearing in Energy and Commerce. That hasn't happened either. We're the committee of jurisdiction. You talk about working people, it's Obamacare that puts a 40% tax on union plans and employer plans that exceed a certain level of cost, and they don't index it. Now, I don't know where the gentlelady is on the Cadillac tax, but I want to repeal it. I never voted for it. And so if you want to enshrine the Affordable Care Act in its entirety, make no changes, then I guess you're for a 40% tax on the kind of insurance plans that my building trades people negotiated to get, and other unions in the face of, instead of getting wage increases. We've delayed that. And hospitals, when you look at the cuts in the Affordable Care Act coming at our hospitals in rural areas that serve lower income areas, the dish payments, we put off those cuts to our hospitals last cycle under Republican leadership. And we're going to have faced that question in this Congress under Democrat leadership. So when you vote to delay those dish cuts again, if you do that, you're voting to repeal or delay part of Obamacare. You know, I hear all these 60, 70 votes to do these things with Obamacare. It repealed the Class Act, which was a long-term health insurance program, was destined for failure, and even President Obama signed its repeal. I can go through a whole list of things that got repealed. We're the only ones that ever get tagged with voting to repeal. And as far as our commitment to pre-existing condition protection, it is real, it is robust, and it always was in everything we did. Yeah, I know what the political rhetoric was. I've run campaigns. I've been around that. I know how you could nuance around, but we always protected people with pre-existing conditions. Always. Period. Hard stop. Protected people with pre-existing conditions. And what came out of my committee and came across this House floor, they were always covered. Always. So I hear the political rhetoric, but I know the facts. And see, I'm an old journalism major, and I believe in facts. And the facts of the matter are 1332 waivers have given our states an opportunity to give our citizens an affordable health insurance plan. Not one that I guess you'll defend, $38,000 a year in premiums, $11,000 a year in deductibles, copay, you got out-of-pocket costs. How's that working for anybody? And shouldn't that 60-year-old couple in Nebraska have a chance to have a better plan option? Nope, guess not. Washington's going to decide it all for you. Write your check, 38 grand. That's for the premiums, 11,000 out-of-pocket cost your deductibles. Then maybe you can get something covered, right? Well, what's left? We know from this Kaiser study I've cited earlier, it was in Axios, people wipe out their savings, they put it on their credit cards, they borrow from their friends, or they simply don't get coverage. That's the world you want to freeze frame and leave in place. That's not what Republicans are for. We want innovation. We want choice. We believe in our states having the opportunity to innovate and do it even better. Not to go back to the old ways. No, that's not what we're for. I know that's what Democrats want to label us as being for, but it's not true. And we have proven results in opioids, community health centers, the longest funding for children's health insurance program in the history of the United States of America under Republican leadership, 10 years. We are the ones, Republicans, that led the effort to invest in medical research at unprecedented rates under what Fred Upton put forward and what Newt Gingrich put forward. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Good vote.
The gentlewoman, pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania will be postponed.
Thank you.
Okay. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part A of House Report 116-51, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Brown of Maryland. Amendment number 7 by Mr. Holding of North Carolina. Amendment number 11 by Mr. Malinowski of New Jersey. Amendment number 12 by Ms. Wild of Pennsylvania. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for recorded vote on amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report 116-51 by the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Brown, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part A of House Report number 116-51, offered by Mr. Brown of Maryland.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
And on the floor of the House now, votes on amendments to the pre-existing conditions legislation the members have been working on today. This amendment, offered by Anthony Brown, a Democrat of Maryland, would keep state waivers in place that help establish reinsurance programs and keep premiums lower. A final vote on the underlying measure is expected in this second and final round of votes for the day. The bill would require insurance companies to cover patients with pre-existing conditions. Now, while members are voting during this 15-minute vote, we'll take a look at some more of the details of the underlying bill.
The House continues work on a healthcare legislation in support of the 2010 federal healthcare law. Shira Stein covers healthcare policy for Bloomberg Law. Tell us what this legislation would do.
This legislation would require the Trump administration to rescind a guidance that they put out in 2018 that would allow states to apply for certain innovation waivers and change the way that they are doing insurance in their states. But this guidance kind of changed the meaning of what it looked like Congress intended with the original law.
Steny Hoyer, the majority leader, tweeted this week, as the Trump administration attacks millions of Americans' health care, the House will vote this week to reverse the administration's ACA sabotage, protect Americans with pre-existing condition, and start to address the rising cost of prescription drug prices. What about the pre-existing conditions? What would the law do?
Well, the guidance would allow states to change their current policies when it comes to insurance, which theoretically could allow them to get rid of protections for pre-existing conditions. Now, no states have actually applied for a waiver since this guidance came out. So we're not exactly sure how it could be implemented, but there's a theoretical possibility that it could lead to a lack of protections.
Not surprisingly, Republican Billy Long of Louisiana taking a different view on the proposed legislation. In fact, on the effect on pre-existing conditions. His tweet says that the Democrats claim the bill would protect individuals with pre-existing conditions. In reality, this bill would do nothing more than eliminate healthcare choices for states. Why is that the Republican view?
Republicans see this as a way for states to kind of figure out their own way. They say, Republicans love to allow states to come up with their own solutions, to come up with their own ways to do insurance. And that's one of the things that states are doing with these innovation waivers and with this guidance from the Trump administration.
On additional legislation, you're tweeting, breaking, the House is voting on a bill next week that includes the CREATES Act, the Blocking Act, and bills to shore up the ACA. Is all of this in response to efforts in years past by Republicans to eliminate or do away with the Affordable Care Act?
Yes, but it's also in efforts to get Republicans to have to vote yes on these bills. They're pairing them with a bunch of what Republicans and Democrats kind of see as must-pass drug pricing legislation that would help get generic drugs to market faster. And so the theoretical idea is that they can get Republicans to vote yes on these bills to shore up the ACA if they also have to vote on bills to lower prescription drug prices.
Let's go back to the health care bill that the House is beginning with this week. The Rules Committee has made 12 amendments in order. Give us an example of what we may see in debate.
Well, some of the amendments are kind of interesting. Republicans have introduced multiple amendments to change the name of the bill itself to say, oh, this is not going to protect pre-existing conditions. This will stop state innovation. There's also some interesting amendments that would have the GAO study effects of these state innovation waivers and things like that. There's also some amendments from Republicans that would actually replace the entire bill text talking about specifically protecting pre-existing conditions, but there's not a lot of clarity of how much that would actually change the intention of the bill.
The House bill, H.R. 986, if it passes the House, what's its fate in the Senate? The White House has already issued a veto threat. What don't they like about it?
Yeah, it's highly unlikely to get a vote in the Senate. I don't see Mitch McConnell bringing it to a vote on the floor. The White House doesn't like it because it would get rid of what they see as allowing states to innovate insurance markets more, and it would get rid of their protections.
Shira Stein covers healthcare policy for Bloomberg Law. You can read her reporting at bloomberglaw.com, and she's on Twitter at Shira M. Stein. Thanks so much.
And here on the floor, the House now votes on 4 amendments to that pre-existing conditions legislation that members have been working on today. This amendment will keep state waivers in place. A final vote on the measure expected during the second and final round of votes for the day. The bill would require insurance companies to cover patients with pre-existing conditions. And while members continue to vote, we'll take a look at more details on another measure that the House worked on today.